Good evening, and welcome to the Issaquah City Council Special Council Committee Work Session for Wednesday, November 7th. Our sole item for this evening is ID 0348, Proposed 2019 Budget Deliberations. We are continuing. These folks in the audience, so always good to have guests join us for this, probably the most critical thing that we do in the year. So with that, I will hand it over to City Administrator Moon.
Great, thank you. We're going to start off with where we left off last time, and that's talking about capital projects. So our game plan on the 2019 budget in terms of the capital program was to incorporate the 2019 capital projects that were shown in the adopted 5-year CIP. So 2019 was year 2 of that plan. In addition, we wanted to incorporate the Parks Plan proposed projects into this list. You know that we had some placeholder projects. We also were a little bit out of sync with timing on that, and we anticipated needing to do this extra step of incorporating those recommendations. Jeff's going to talk more about that as we get further into our agenda. I can also relay that Parks Board has had an opportunity to see those recommendations, discuss those recommendations, kind of give the head nod to the fact that that's consistent with the Parks Plan. And I wanted to mention again that we do still have projects that are shown as unfunded in 2019, and we'll talk about those as well. Our policy for the CIP says that we will do just what we have done, which is try to incorporate the projects from the capital plan into the next year's annual budget, provided that there are those projects are financially feasible. And so that means going through that exercise each year of saying what revenue do we have for those projects and how has that picture changed. And in some cases, in one case in particular, we'll talk about how the city during this interim time of 2018 year 1, preparing for year 2, applied for a grant and only got part of that grant. So we're providing you with an update on the capital picture and how we have brought it into the annual operating budget. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
All right. It's a great start. Awesome, awesome. All right, thank you, Emily. Good evening, Council.
Little professional touches that mean so much.
It really is. It is. Keeps us on our toes, at least me. All right. Well, as Emily highlighted, I want to really quickly highlight the approach and really the intent that we took as we looked at our Parks capital budget this year. As was mentioned, actually, as we were going through the CIP process last year, we really anticipated the need for this work as the park plan was going to be adopted in 2018. Now that it has been adopted, we really thought that the opportunity to adjust the 2019 program to be informed by that strategic plan was really a sets us off on the right foot and allows our time, our energy, our investment in 2019 to really be informed and move forward with the community priorities of the park plan. Overall, our goal was just to do that, to align this program with that plan and with the priorities of the community. The initial CIP program represented a $4.2 million investment. With this proposed adjustments, and I'll go through them project by project real briefly, it now represents a $3.7 million program. I mentioned that just in saying that we were very aware and conscious as we make this one-year adjustment, not to be seeking to make a bigger investment, but one that's certainly wise and prudent. We really see this as a one-year correction or a one-year adjustment just because of the sequencing of the CIP and our park strategic plan. We think by doing this 1 year, we will now be able to, with the next 5-year CIP that will begin initiating next year. We'll then be able to align the 2020 and the 2020 to 2024 capital program with that adopted park CIP. So this is the sheet you saw a couple weeks ago at our prior work session. What it's intended to do on the left-hand column highlights or notes what the proposed 2019 CIP program was within that 5-year CIP. The column on the right represents what we're proposing in this preliminary budget and the adjustments that we are requesting and seeking to make. I would note that in this comparison, you'll see that there are some programs that stayed the same. Some are still there by name, but in some cases, we adjusted or reduced what that investment's going to be in 2019. We introduced about 4 new programs or projects. And then there are, I believe it's 6 projects that we are recommending to be put on hold and revisited when we do the 5-year CIP next year. So I'd love to go through. These are the proposed projects that were on that right-hand column. Just quickly highlight these and note what they are, and certainly open for any discussion after that. The first project pertaining to Central Park. This was a prior commitment, a bike skills park. It was made a while ago. I actually we have some funding from one of the developers up there as part of the Highlands. We have approached, as I've mentioned before, Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance. We're working with Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance right now. This would be creating a introductory level, sort of youth level bike skills park within Central Park. The next project, Confluence Park, this really focuses on turf improvements. We were awarded a $200,000 grant from Department of Commerce, so this will be half funded through that grant. What this really will do is allow us to increase the functionality of Confluence Park. What we're looking at doing is taking the meadow areas, the grass areas outside of the creek buffer, and adding irrigation, adding a more consistent turf that will be able to support events, that will be able to support more just drop-in community use at that park. That park was really seen as a high priority, a very marquee park within our system as part of the park plan. The third project up there, Creekside Sensitive Land Acquisition, this would be carrying forward and continuing that priority. A portion of the funding, the $1.3 million, is also a requested reappropriation of some 2018 funds to be carried forward into 2019 to continue our priorities, our community priorities on that matter. The fourth item, the dog park. This was an item that you as council added to the CIP. It certainly meshes very well with the park strategic plan as a very high priority project. We're in community engagement right now to identify a site. In fact, we have our next meeting next week, November 15th. We're proposing $200,000 to move towards construction and get construction for that facility next year. The next item is also a program that was in the 19 CIP previously, Park Master Planning. We'd be proposing in this program, informed by the Park Strategic Plan, really 3 of the high priority, really marquee elements of the system. We'd love to begin master planning on Tibbetts Valley Park, reimagining that, as that park is so well positioned to be a community park to support the central Issaquah growth that we're anticipating. We really want to work with the community in reimagining what that park can and should be for the next 20 or 30 years. The other site that we would be wanting to master plan is Memorial Park, Depot Park, and Pedestrian Park right here in Old Town. Again, a well-positioned, wonderful park that is ready to, I think, be better linked to Front Street, be better linked to the Rainier Trail Corridor. The third project that we want to initiate some real community engagement and master planning on is Issaquah Creek Trail Corridor. If you remember in the park strategic plan, this was really that anchor element that really is an opportunity to extend from the south border of Issaquah at Squaw Valley Park all the way up to Lake Sammamish through the state park, a corridor that would have recreational elements, trail experiences, riparian restoration, but beginning the effort of actually looking at what trail alignment would look like, what are some of the really focused, detailed elements of that project. Blackberry Park, this is a reappropriation request from 2018. Blackberry Park was recently transferred from King County to the city. Along with that transfer, $20,000. This funding was provided from King County. This is just requesting a reappropriation of that park. Blackberry Park is a very small park in the South Cove area of the city. The Falls Drive Trail improvements, this too was a prior funded project. This is a trail that connects Central Park down and through Issaquah, a portion of Issaquah Highlands. There have been some historical, some speed conflicts and other things going on that trail that we want to go in and make some improvements to reduce some of those concerns. The next 4 projects are new projects that we're proposing to be added to the program. The Front Street properties, what is in quotes, placemaking. As you're all aware, the city has been very successful in beginning to assemble some properties on Front Street, just to the south of Old Town. One of the things that really came out in the Park Strategic Plan is how might we see opportunities to take some of these existing city properties and rather than waiting until we have funds to fully develop it, how might we activate these spaces on an interim basis? And so we really think those properties and the amount of properties that we have assembled are a great opportunity to engage the public and find ways to create some interim uses on that property, some ways to complement Front Street and some of our business patrons as well as community residents. Hillside Park, this too is a not only high priority project identified in the park plan, but also one that I know just before I arrived, there was some community engagement around Hillside Park and what to do and what investments we want to make. We're also aware that 40 acres has multiple uses. It has a cemetery within it, has a small park. There's a strong community desire and an opportunity to create a trail link from Squaw Mountain down into downtown. We'd love to take the opportunity to, rather than thinking of those individually, let's think of that site collectively, do some public engagement, some master planning, and do some phase 1 improvements at Hillside. The Swamp Trail Boardwalk, this is really a capital maintenance project in a lot of ways. We have our existing boardwalk up at Lake Tradition Park. It's in need of replacement. The boardwalk is in bad need of some replacement. So that's what that project is. The East Sunset Trailhead, this is really a culmination of a regional effort that we've been working on. Also, one of the priorities of the Park Strategic Plan was how we connect our city system to the regional system around us. We've been working with our partners at DNR and King County Parks and really looking and reimagining that whole West Tiger area and public land from East Sunset, Lake Tradition, all the way to the High Point exit. This would be an opportunity for us to look at that trailhead, look at how that relates to also the trailhead on 2nd Avenue behind the high school. We've had some initial preliminary conversations with Puget Sound Energy as well, but really an opportunity to make sure we are seeing that trailhead as the gateway that it really is into West Tiger.
So, Jeff, I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So, first off, on the dog park, you said something to the effect of get building in 2019. Is there additional, I just can't remember on this one, is there additional spend beyond 2019, or is $200K the whole thing?
We anticipate $200K being the whole thing. Again, one of the things that's coming out in the community engagement is should we look at creating one off-leash dog park that's going to serve all our needs, or maybe the answer is multiple. Our goal, though, is to get construction done on one of them in 2019.
Okay. And then the other question I have is around park master planning, 550, and then East Sunset Trailhead, I think there's supposed to be an extra zero there.
There
I'm going to
is,
assume
yeah.
it's 480. So those add up to $1 million. What do we get for that $1 million?
So you get a lot of, I think with the master plans of those really anchor facilities, we're really getting a vision and getting a big picture understanding of what those spaces, what those places are going to be. We're getting an adopted master plan that would be pre-design and really being ready to complete that project. With East Sunset Trailhead, we're getting not only that planning work, but also a expanded, more usable, functional trailhead there at East Sunset.
So does that mean like someone's going to create like ready to start construction plans? I mean, at the end of the day, what's the deliverable? I assume this is from consultants.
Yeah, the deliverable on the master planning would be, 3 master plans that would be ready to move towards construction, and really determining, are we looking at phased construction of those projects? Those are all projects of a large enough scale, they probably are, but it's positioning us to move into that. Similar, if you will, to the Gilman Corridor plan.
Okay. And then the East Sunset Trailhead, what's the deliverable on that? Is that also similar? It's
Similar
construction ready?
with, again, it's a funding to expand that trailhead, to improve the trail routing up through that trailhead. We have some conflicts with bikers and pedestrians, so.
Yeah, what I'm trying to understand is, do those amounts include actual on-the-ground changes, or are they both just planning?
East Sunset would be actual construction with that as well.
Gotcha. All right, thanks. Questions? Several. We'll start with Bill.
Yeah, just trying to keep track of all the dollars, because as you went through that, you mentioned some of this was funding that was combined with other funding or the grants from developer, whatever. So my question overall is that 3.7 million at the bottom, that's the cost of the whole project that would go there. That's not the direct cost to the city.
Correct.
Reading that. So we almost need another column, like you mentioned, in the Confluence Park, 200,000 from another. So that's only 200,000 to us, another 200,000 from a grant from the.
Yeah, so like all of our capital programs, the revenue, you're right, is a diverse set of revenue.
So that's the cost of all these projects, but it's not a cost to the city. A lot of that will be covered by some other sources. So could you tell me what that number would be overall, approximate somehow? Because we have to vote on what we're actually spending as well as the cost of the project.
I can get you that info. I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me. I do know, like, in particular, the grants and sensitive area land acquisition, that dollar amount includes a pretty significant amount of conservation futures funds and other grants. But I could get you that breakdown of what that 3.7 is.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Councilmember Hunt.
Thank you. I had a related question about the Creekside and sensitive land acquisition. So you mentioned part of that is carry forward. So I would like to know how much of that, and that can also be with the other information about how much are these things costing for the city. And then also on the Hillside Park and Front Street properties placemaking, it sounded to me like there was an aspect that was planning, and there was also an aspect that was on the ground construction or changes that were being made. So I wondered, what's the approximate breakdown of planning funding versus construction on those?
On Front Street and Hillside? Were those the?
Yes, if those, and the point of my question is to sort of understand how much is planning versus how much is construction. So if there are other ones where they're together, then that question would also apply. But I understood that those were the two where it's funding that covers both for 2019.
Yeah, the placemaking, the Front Street interim activation is probably a relatively small amount of planning dollars. I would probably say in the neighborhood of 25 to 30,000, with a good amount of that going towards activation of that space in some way, shape, or form. Hillside is probably, given pulling all of those uses of the site into doing some planning is probably more of a 50-50 split. When you look at, again, how do we best address some of the, how to address cemetery and the cemetery board's interest, the cemetery's need for what that's going to be the next 20 or 30 years. It's probably about a 50-50 split.
Sorry, Councilmember Winterstein, who lives about a block from that park.
Thank you. Jeff, could you please go back one slide? I've heard questions from Tola, Bill, and Vicky this evening, which one way I hear them is, actually, if we had this information in the context of a capital plan, those questions would, the answers to those questions would be in that plan. I'm concerned about this. The number is lower, so it looks good, but I did a little accounting here. From that list, there are 6 projects we said we were going to do at least some portion in 2019. They're just gone. And we're not going to do any portion of them, and they have some other effect downstream. We don't know. There are 5 that are still on the list, but every one of them, of these 5, have changes. We're either spending more or spending less, so something is different. Maybe there's more design or less design or some construction where there wasn't before. But the plan that we had originally understood for each one of those has changed to some degree. There are 2 reappropriations and on there, so that's Falls Creek and Blackberry, which you don't have on the left-hand column. And then there's the 4 new ones, which are from the Park Strategic Plan. And I thought I understood we had some like placeholders in there, but they're not lined up with any kind of placeholders. Maybe I misunderstood whether or not we had placeholders or not for those coming. Certainly not dollar amounts, but we had maybe some PK number assigned to them. Mm-hmm. I look at all that and go, boy, this really feels like a really remade capital plan. This is a really remade capital plan. 6 gone, 5 dramatically changed, 4 new in, and we don't know how much is design, how much is construction, we don't know what the deliverables are, which happen to be in capital plans. So I know we're going to redo the capital plan. We're going to. This is a major resale overhaul of the Parks capital plan without overhauling the Parks capital plan. And so I'm just realizing that right now. I think these questions are fair that they've asked, and I know you will do your best to get the answers to them. But I got to figure out what this means to me at this point. This is not what I thought. I understood some change. We would make some changes, but the degree here is quite substantial. And I feel like what we did to vet and approve the plan last time, and it's a 5-year plan without years. We could see in there funding sources, expenses by year. We knew what in unfunded component portions were. Of course, we don't have any of that with all of these wholesale changes. So I'm certainly not against anything. Everything sounds interesting, but if I want to redo a capital plan, I want this in the context of a capital plan, and here it isn't.
Thank you. Other questions right now? Councilmember Ray.
So I have just a request, really. So when you're putting together the grant funding for Councilmember Ramos's request, can you also identify what grant funding has restrictions with it? Is that a yes or a question?
Yeah. I'm just trying to restrictions in terms of what the parameters of that grant are.
It was a land conservation grant,
Mm-hmm.
so that means we can't build a dog park there.
Right.
Or whatever the restriction is.
Absolutely. And yeah, any grant source that's identified as real, you're right, is been awarded for a purpose. So we'll identify what that is.
And then I was doing a similar kind of a color coding as Councilmember Winterstein, and there's a fair amount of change from this year to that year, and understanding that the plan plays into it. But I guess there are things we're not getting that we thought were of value when we put together the capital plan, and now they're of less value. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. So we can do it now, or you can do it and provide it in writing, that's fine too. Just, why we think that it makes sense not to do the Bear Creek Trailhead development now. So that would be helpful for us or for me to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. I certainly understand. And again, I think our goal and our recognition, even as the CIP was being adopted, and those CIP projects were projects identified in prior years. We did the best we could as staff to remind. You probably heard me ad nauseum. I think every time I came up during the CIP process saying the strategic plan is going to change this. I understand, and I'll certainly do the best I can to provide that information to you. So appreciate it.
So I think that the through line that you're hearing here is just an interest in understanding this aspect more than just the shorter conversation this evening, because it's a topic that is both a big dollar amount and, of course, something that's so near and dear to the hearts of so many folks, both on council and in the city.
Absolutely. Yep.
Other questions right now? Nope. Oh, Councilmember Hunt.
Thanks. Also, as part of that, I wondered if there are any, as part of the information that you can provide at a future date, any of these items that were on the capital plan that are covered in other ways, or those sorts of things. Especially, I'm looking at playground equipment replacement and wondering if there's a different plan for taking care of some of these if they aren't going to be in the budget. So sort of, if there's any information to that, I would be interested to understand it better.
Absolutely.
Council Deputy President Batiste.
First of all, thanks, Jeff, for all of the information. And just wanted to reiterate, I think that being able to understand for me as we're going forward what pieces of this we're planning and construction would be helpful just as we're going forward. So mixing that in with everything else that we've talked about. And then just a quick question on the Front Street Properties placemaking. Could you just give me an example of what that might be?
Yeah. Boy. So as we have a lawn area, as those houses have been demolished, as we have a creekside opportunity, how might we incorporate encouraging picnicking? How might we find ways to encourage ways that the community can use that? Maybe we work with the downtown Issaquah Association and look at how to maybe incorporate seasonal food trucks into that space. But there's ways to think about activating that in some pretty engaging ways.
Okay. Thank you. And then just to clarify too, on the dog park, you were saying you thought that the 200,000 would cover the one dog park or first dog park. However, okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, and I'm going to have Christina talk to transportation 2019 budget.
Great.
The transportation capital projects listed above display what was presented in the 2019 second year of the CIP, and in the right-hand column is what's presented in the 2019 preliminary budget. Some of the changes are attributable to project schedules and reauthorizations. And then there's a new project for Gilman Lofts intersection 3 trails signal. Sorry. Questions?
I'll just add one quick note on all of these project reauthorizations. It's important to keep in mind that they are like trying to estimate return to fund balance and use of fund balance. There's snapshots in time. In many cases, we develop these assumptions, these estimates in July, refine one last time, say in August, and then it gets kind of put into print in September. Meanwhile, weather happens, bids come in or don't come in, et cetera, and things change. So I'll give you an example of that. If you look at TR 007 on the right-hand side, 62nd Street Southeast Improvements, that's a bit of anticipating what we might be able to accomplish on, I'm going to say, the punch list, and get that project completed by the end of this year. That was the project schedule. We're still anticipating having that project completed by the end of the year, substantially complete. But estimating what pieces will still lag into 2019, whether that's landscaping or something like that, it is a bit of guesswork. So that's the. Some of the changes are just those reauthorizations, just trying to estimate. There's some additional changes that we're going to show on a subsequent slide that correspond to changes in funding sources, and I'll point out one here, that's Newport Way, State Route 900 to Southeast 54th. You'll see we originally posted a budget for you of $4 million in 2019, but I'll show you in a subsequent slide that we have since revised that estimate based on better understanding of the grant revenue that has been received.
Councilmember Ray.
So are you going to go into detail on these?
No, but we have some staff here that
Okay.
could be helpful.
So I'm trying to understand the slide. And so some of the projects are on the right and the left, and some are just on the right. But they have TR numbers, so I don't understand why I don't see that on both sides of the equation, or both sides of the balance sheet, if you will.
Question, and I'm going to jump in here. I actually opened up the CIP, and so TR 007 didn't have anything planned in 2019. It was planned to be complete in 2018.
Great.
So it's not actually on our 2019 plan, so there's some, and I think Emily kind of addressed that one. So I'm going through and doing that same analysis on the rest of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. Those reauthorizations would have been 2018 projects, therefore they wouldn't have been on the originally adopted 2019 list. So that's one place where you'll see differences. And you'll see those reauthorizations then showing up on
Okay.
2019.
So my question really was, okay, just an explanation that that's the one, which is TR 007, because we just love the way that sounds. Isn't in the left-hand column because it wasn't a 2018 funded project, it's just a 2019 and beyond funded project.
Just to clarify, it was a 2018 project, so it wasn't anticipated in 2019. But now that was based on the plan as it was designed in 2017. And so now we're into 2018, we're almost done. We think we're done with the 2018 planned projects, and yet we anticipate there might be some expense that will roll over into 2019. So what you see on the right-hand column is what has been incorporated with a few changes that I'll show you soon, has been incorporated into the 2019 budget.
All right, let me try this one more time. I'm feeling awfully dim right now. So when in 2018, we thought that in 2019, we would spend $131,000 on 2nd Avenue. And we still plan to spend $131,000 on 2nd Avenue. In 2018, we didn't think we were going to spend any additional funds in 2019 on 62nd Street improvements, and now we think we're going to need an additional $1 million.
Correct.
Yay, okay, I got it.
Correct. And the word additional is just one I will put a little asterisk on, not necessarily additional, it's just the split between years is shifting a little bit. That's how capital project budgeting happens.
$1 million, or in that case, $1 million more than we originally had anticipated to spend in that year.
In that year, but maybe not overall for
Right,
the project.
right.
Indeed, not overall
Yes.
for the project.
Right, so it's the cash flow thing. Got it.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. This feels like a lot of, this is like true to the plan. And I think there are, and that example you just went over with TR 007 is I can see that in every one of those that's a reappropriation, like Northwest Sammamish Road. we thought maybe we'd spend some, we appropriated something for 18, nothing's going to happen. And it's certainly not, it's not in the plan for 19, so you're saying, hey, let's put it in the plan for 19. Same with Front Street, streetscape as well. And I can, and so this feels like what the kind of the evolution or kind of the fine tuning or adjustments year over year to parts of the plan that like I would expect. Contrasting that with parks. My one question, two questions. The two Newport projects, you've probably, I know you've mentioned them to us many times before. I know in one case we didn't get a grant that we were expecting, but the numbers are significant. So I'm just going to ask you to go over those one more time since we're talking about all of this. And then could you say something about Gilman Lofts? I know we have a DA with that developer, that property owner developer, and I think that says something about the timing of them wanting to go forward with their work.
Maybe I'll have Sheldon come up just in case. I'm debating whether to skip ahead a couple of slides because we have the unfunded slide a little bit later on after we talk about some other types of capital projects. But I'll just verbalize right now that PR 022, Newport Way, 954th, we had previously and are still showing on this slide that we anticipated having an unfunded amount of $4 million. And the latest projection is actually 2.5. We got part of a grant, but not full amount that we had requested. And you're correct about Gilman. We have indeed some developer contribution. And I want to say this is our share, but here comes Sheldon.
Thank you. The Gilman Lofts funding in 2019 preliminary budget, the 375, that was contained in the agreement for the developer that the council approved. The 375 was the city's share. The developer's responsible for doing the construction work, and I think their costs are on the order of $1 million plus. And so the facility did not get built in 2018, so this is essentially just carrying that money forward from last year or from this year to next year.
I'm sorry, Paul, did you have a further question? Oh, okay. Councilmember Ramos.
I guess what I heard, Paul's question, it wasn't answered. So there's a $3 million, the two Newport Way projects, the cost is, you put them together and it's $3 million more than anticipated, which is quite significant. And I know we lost a little part of a grant, but I thought I heard the question was, could you go over the numbers for those two projects and how they got to where they are?
So do we want to, is this something you want to take and get back to us, or is this something?
I'd love to try to answer as much as we can. Otherwise,
Okay.
we're gonna run out of time. I guess maybe I need clarification on exactly what the question is. Are you asking
So-
about the total
Right,
cost
so
of
I'm
the
just looking at-
projects, or what was anticipated? Because it's all phased, and this was just the 19 phase. So is it a question about what was planned for 19 and reserved in the budget, and then what actually we have revenue for this year? Is that the question?
I think. Simply stated in the math, how we were trading projects and so forth. But here, if you add those two and plan in 19, 2.5 and 4 is about $3 million. And now what we're actually going to spend is really $7 million. So how do we go from $4 million to $7 million? That's what I'm trying to get to. And you can explain it to me later if you like, but
No.
that's quite an increase.
I'm happy.
That was what I thought you asked. That's why I
Okay, I'm
re-asked
sorry.
it.
So I'm happy to respond to that for the two Newport Way projects. In 2018, the numbers on the left are the numbers that were reflected in the CIP that were expected expenditures in 2019. In 2018, the budget had numbers that are not shown in that left-hand column. There's funding that was not spent in 2018 that is a reauthorization, which is a component of the 4 and the 3 over here on the right-hand side. So it's a reauthorization of funds from this year to next year. For instance, I believe on the Maple to Sunset project, I believe the council authorized almost a $3 million budget for this year. We're reauthorizing somewhere around 1.5 or 6 or something like that. So you start to, the numbers start to climb, but it's a reauthorization. It's not additional money.
So I think it's clarification, like on the Parks project. When we see numbers like that we don't have broken down, is how much is reauthorization, how much is online, how much is coming from other sources.
Yes.
That we get also grants and various other things. And so if we lost a grant, that would show up too. We need those pieces, or those numbers, just big numbers by themselves don't make sense to us. Because also now it's $3 million more than we're going to spend if I don't have any more information. Right?
Thank you all. As you know, this is our first biennial CIP, and so I think we're clearly learning what we need to give you in order for you to process the tweaks that happen in the second year. We have some overall pictures that get you to back up a little bit and say, okay, what is overall unfunded still? That's been in your packet. It was previously provided as well. But I can see when we start to show on the project level, it would be more helpful for us to perhaps, we were trying to avoid producing new CIPs every year and therefore new project sheets every year. And because once we produce that project sheet, particularly for a project that is already in motion, it's not accurate the moment we hand it over to you, because costs are happening out there right now on many of these projects that are, say, in year 2. So we're trying to avoid that, producing a CIP every year, but clearly we can do a better job of at least demonstrating to you what's reauthorization, reminding you of the revenue sources, and so we'll aim to do that next time. And I think we can huddle and provide a little bit of that information, again, without doing the full-blown thing.
So I have a totally different question. So as I look at this, it's fair to say then that basically the $8 million is rollover? The difference between what was budgeted?
No, it's not. It's, and that's why it gets a little bit confusing. I'm gonna skip ahead to a slide that will show you unfunded. If you look there on the right-hand column, what's unfunded in 2019 is $13 million and change for the transportation CIP. So we have only a portion of the planned projects from the 2019 CIP that have designated funding sources.
Okay, so can you go back to
Sure.
the previous ones? So you're saying that, given our druthers, we'd like to spend $20.4 million in 2019, and you're saying 13.3 of that is unfunded at the moment?
Yes, and then I'm going to show you this slide, and you can see where that 13 is coming from. It's coming from these projects. These are the unfunded projects, either wholly, I think wholly. Yep. These projects would not have any work effort put to them in 2019 because they still lack funding.
Okay, so can you go back to, I'm sorry.
Other one? Okay.
That one, yeah. So, okay, so the 20.4 is, if we had the money, that's what it would take to get up to where we plan to be for the CIP.
Correct.
Okay, so my question, and that's got, okay, so we're saying to do that, we got to find 13.3 million in the seat cushions, right? Got it, okay. But my question is also still a little different. Does it is, this does say that, so some of this was, there were cost inflators, but there's a sizable fraction of this is monies that were intended to be spent by now in 2018 that were not spent. Yes, maybe
Yes.
not 8 million, because again, some of that is cost increase, right? But some.
A portion of it, yes.
Yeah. So my question really comes down to our ability, and this is something I think I've asked before about in council, which gets at our ability to spend money, right? And how quickly we can execute the things that we have in plans. And if we had, I mean, I don't know exactly what we intended to spend last year, but let's say it was 12 million, just for the sake of arguments. And if you had to roll over, let's say 6 or 7 of that, that tells me that we have a hard time spending what we intend to spend, right?
Sure.
So if we found the 13.3 million in the seat cushions, right? Could we spend 20.4? Because it sort of seems like we have a problem, executing what we planned in 18.
Yeah.
And if we plan to execute even more in 19, we'd have an even bigger problem?
It's possible. Every one of these projects has a story, and I spoke a little bit about that kind of inquiry area last time we met. I'm going to just give you an example. I may not have all the dots in the right places, but just looking at that right-hand column, some of the reauthorizations, 12th Avenue, SR 900, 17th, that one is a reauthorization. What's the story behind that? Well, it's not because we couldn't execute on it. It's not for a lack of city staff planning and going and seeking contractors, et cetera. It's because we had partnerships with Costco and state parks, and we were trying to integrate with state parks, EIS and master planning, and so that effort was delayed. It hasn't progressed as quickly as we expected. 62nd, we just talked about, it's just in case we have punch list things that roll to 2019. I'm skipping ITS camera system upgrade because I don't recall the story on that. Northwest Sammamish Road, we talked about last time. Council, at the end of the budget deliberations, end of CIP deliberations, said, we're super eager to do this project. Let's put money aside. Staff had said, we don't think that project will be able to be completed in 18, but there was a desire to reserve some funds and demonstrate commitment on that. Front Street Streetscape is a project that I would say we did not execute on in a timely fashion. So they each have a different story. Some are within our control, some are not. That's the story on those projects. Other years it may be because bids came in too high and we decided we're going to take a timeout, the market will cool, and it will be advantageous for us. So there's always a different story.
Council Deputy President Batiste.
Thank you for that, Emily. I know that this gets really complicated. I would like you to talk just a little bit about the increase for Providence Point. Could you talk a bit about that?
You want me to?
Give me an overview.
The Providence Point increase between the projected, I believe it was around 6 million, 6.2 to the 8.1. As we've gotten into the design and gotten to a point of a final engineer's estimate at like the 95% level, we've found that with the storm vault being needed in the middle of the road, bedrock construction risk, a number of other items dealing with utility locates and things of that sort that have come up, plus escalation over time, that project cost has gone up to about 8.1. That's also assessing a contingent factor for risk and dealing with bedrock excavation and other things that we may find when we excavate for a very large vault in the middle of 43rd. So there's risk involved in this project, so the contingency is a little bit higher than what we would normally do at this stage of the game, but those are some of the major elements that are playing a role. Plus, we also had some increase in retaining walls to ensure we had sidewalks through the project, not just in the intersection, but from downhill of it, as well as to the city limits on the uphill side. So there was some additional sidewalk work that we were adding into the project.
Thank you, Sean.
Councilmember Ray.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure I really am getting all this. So there are some things that we had planned to spend in 2018 and we did not. So those funds are being pushed forward into 19 and being reauthorized. And so I'm assuming those funds exist in fund balances, so they're not net new dollars.
That's correct.
Okay.
Unless they were again shown on the unfunded list, but yes,
Yeah, okay.
that is correct.
Yeah, unless they were on the unfunded list, great. So I guess what I'm looking for would be helpful for me is to kind of know what the net new dollars are. Because there are some of these that are more expensive than we had in the CIP, and so we're going to need to authorize additional funding. And then there's some of these, part of that $8 million there, that were in the CIP, and exist in fund balances, and then we're moving forward. So no net new dollars. Fair?
Yes, although I would say by and large, the net new is showing up on unfunded. And if you count against it, the use of fund balance is just those carryover funds.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. Thank you for all this information. I'm looking at that slide right now, and I really think the column on the right, there is a portion of it, some portion less than 13.2 million, which is in the preliminary budget because funding sources have been identified. There's another portion of it worth 13.2, which really isn't in the budget because we don't have funding, because you're not
Because it
proposing
wasn't
funding
before
sources
and
for
it's
it.
not now.
What's
Yes,
that?
that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So that's really not the preliminary budget. The preliminary
correct.
budget is 7, roughly.
That's correct.
7.2.
Yes,
And
we
there's
should have shown it that
13.2
way.
up there that is unfunded. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Other questions right now? All right. Let's continue. This is fun.
Welcome to CIP. All right, we're going to turn back to Christina to talk about 2019 utility capital. And if there are questions, we have
Oh,
folks
but before
here
we do that, I just want to mention, there's a lot of folks in the public here, and I do want to let you know that at the end of the evening, this evening, which will hopefully be about 3 hours after we start, we will take public comment. And I know that seems like a long time to wait and listen to our conversation, but it is improvement over the old days when we didn't do that. So I'll be looking forward to taking public comment at the end of the evening, if you're willing to stay. Continue.
Kind of the same story. Can you? Yes. There we go. Back to the same column on the left, column on the right. So for utilities, there's projects that have been reauthorized into 2019. So WT 005, which is the I-90 water main, 13, the SPAR booster pump station. And then we've had a couple with, that have been combined for East Lake Sam Park drainage. And between 56th and, is that up there? 56th and 51st. Let me look. And some reauthorizations in ST 003 East Lake Sam Parkway drainage. Just to highlight a few.
And I'll just point out, if you were to look at your colorful summary page, kind of looks like this. It's usually at the front of our budget. You would note that a common pattern in water and in stormwater this year where we are utilizing some fund balance. So we collect, we establish rates based on the capital program, the capital needs on a long-term basis. And so we build up some fund balance in order to pay for those future capital improvements. So it's appropriate for us to utilize fund balance in these particular funds in that way. So again, it gets complex because the reauthorization, it's about timing typically. It's about when we're ready to complete the project. It may also be just about cash flow too.
Any questions? All right. Oh, Councilmember Hunt.
The last one on the preliminary budget doesn't have a number associated with it. Is that not in the capital plan, or is it? IH stormwater capacity improvement? Mostly, I'm looking to understand if it was anticipated in the capital improvements or not.
So stormwater capacity improvement has been kind of postponed as it's gone through several reiterations. So I'm not quite understanding the question. You're wondering why it's not in the left-hand column?
Harvey, I have a note on mine that that's actually a reauthorization as well. So
Yeah.
it may be that we just need to add that project number. So
Oh.
sorry about that.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah. I'm not sure that that project actually had a project number. It's been in existence prior to the CIP, and it's been reauthorizations essentially over the years. As Harvey mentioned, it's been delayed for a number of different reasons, and it's delayed from this year to next year because we're wanting to do one more season of wet season monitoring of the systems so that we can dial in the design even better. And that's in coordination with operations so that we can make sure that we're getting it right the first time.
Okay, so then is it fair to say it was anticipated in the capital improvement?
It was anticipated. It just never was assigned an ST number.
It predated the
predated
development that we did in 2017 for the 18 to 22 capital plan.
Okay, thank you.
The original project number was in Aramaic.
Yes, right. It was prior to the nomenclature of ST coming into place, and it was just if you remember the CIP sheets from way back when, it's a priority number, and it was just an order number. It wasn't anything else. So.
Sorry.
Thank you. And done.
You want me to bring it back, Emily?
Yeah, please.
Not done yet. Going one more. Here we go.
Thank you.
Yep.
Aren't there any other questions right now?
Okay, great. I'm going to turn to next slide, technology, equipment, municipal facilities. We kind of lumped it together on this slide because there are fewer projects for each of these areas. And Christina, do you have anything you wanted to relay? I'll point out on municipal facilities, there's a project without a number on that, and that's a project that is is coming forward partly out of Park Strategic Plan, and then also out of conversations with the cemetery board.
I'll just ask real briefly, is that fleet replacement number pretty typical?
You mean typical, like,
Is 600K our typical fleet replacement
I
cost?
think it depends on his replacement plan and what he has coming up, so it aligns with that.
Sorry, he is in
Oh, sorry, not he. It aligns with our fleet replacement plan.
fleet replacement. Okay. I was just curious if that's a typical year, or it caught my eye because it was the largest number on the page.
It is the largest number on the page. We're going to talk in a minute about our fleet fund, and we'll break down what's replacements this year versus new equipment purchases. Those are all really housed in the fleet fund.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Winterstein, then Batiste.
Two technology projects, one the CRM, Citizen Relationship Management, and the one top budget software. I know that Munis is on a year-to-year kind of subscription basis. These are just one and done, or they're going to be reoccurring numbers, expenses with those like Munis? you don't know now, and if you know now, that would be great. But I think it's kind of in line with some of the questions I asked earlier.
For the budget software, some of that is reauthorized into 19, because there's still a few components left. The CRM is new, and part of the ongoing maintenance for the budget software will come through the technology cost allocation as it gets up and running. This is truly the capital setup piece.
Okay, so you're planning the ongoing expenditures through the using cost allocation
That's correct.
policy?
Yeah, this is typical first-year cost when it's software and implementation, it's purchase. We put it on the capital program, especially if it's above that threshold number that we've established. And then in subsequent years, the O&M, the licensing, whatever expense that we have becomes part of the operating budget and is cost allocated out to whoever the users are for that particular system.
Follow-on question?
Yeah, just a really simple comment. We have a category where we buy excavators and excavators and PCs and servers. So that's an interesting category, just by the way.
Indeed. That's a fun shopping trip. Council Deputy President Batiste?
So I think that my question's been answered. I had a very similar question to Paul, but the CRM, so would that cost be typical of what, is that higher because it's implementation year? Or would that be a typical cost going forward?
No, I would expect that the annual cost is quite a bit lower than that. This is that first-year cost. It's going to be largely about the purchase of the software and then some implementation dollars.
Thanks.
Other questions right now on this page? Nope.
Okay, I've seen this before. Just highlighting again that as we continue to update, revise estimates, learn more about particular funding sources, we're keeping track of what we have the money to do and what's unfunded. The unfunded projects that we've gone over in previous slides are all wholly in transportation category. This is a list of those projects with the latest projections. Again, with 43rd traffic signal, this year's scope of work, 2018 scope of work included updating the design and the cost estimates. And so that's why that one has changed. And Sheldon spoke to that. There was also some additional scope elements that were incorporated. The story with Newport Way was just not receiving quite as much of grant as we had expected, but also reflecting costs in the appropriate years. And Maple to Sunset, we're now showing that one is funded. I don't know if Christina might be able to speak to that. Newport Way, Maple to Sunset, you've got a 0 in latest projection. Maybe Sheldon can come up and speak to that.
Yes, we're able to, when we looked at next year's work program for that, and we look at what we have in front of us, we think that we would spend basically the 1.2 million and not have any issues with funding, because we've got that as reauthorization and grant money in the project. It's not just the PSRC grant, but we also have another grant which was an earmark for the Southeast Bypass for another 3.6 million. So it's all grant funded. So there's no funding issue with that project through next year. Grant money is available.
Thank you.
I think that last project, we just trued up some numbers. It's a relatively small amount, and expect to have that funded.
So what does the administration think we should do? So to be where we want to be, we got to find $13.3 million in the seat cushions. what is the administration saying, put off this 13.3?
Yeah, our recommendation for right now is proceed with the projects that we have that are feasible, as your policy says, that we have funding sources for. And so we're poised and ready to continue work on those on January 1. For these projects that are listed as still having funding gaps or newer, bigger funding gaps, I think we need a separate conversation. These are sizable enough projects that it would be my recommendation that we talk through possible debt financing scenarios and what ripple effects those have. They won't have an effect on, they shouldn't have much of an effect on your 2019 budget, but would have an effect on your debt service payments in 2020 if you were to debt finance them. There's other sources of funding, but council has not yet decided on a transportation funding strategy, and so I think it's part of that larger conversation.
So is the net to sort of squirrel away this number, to put it, burn it, etch it in the back of our brains that there's 13.2 million worth of work that we want to do in 2019 that that we're not currently going to be able to do, and then when we have these other conversations to recall fondly this conversation?
Yes, and as you know, the Ad Hoc Finance Committee has been talking about this for some time, not just this 13, but the whole transportation program, whether that's our concurrency projects or the unfunded amount in the entire 5-year CIP. So I think we want to pull that all together, and we'll have opportunities as well with the reiteration of the 5-year CIP. Next year's our on year, so we're in redevelopment mode on that long-term capital plan. We'll have additional opportunities through that to talk about priorities and funding sources for each of these projects.
But just to be clear so everybody understands, that's not a conversation that we have before the adoption of the budget. This is a conversation that we have in early 2019.
Correct. That's my recommendation, is that we move forward with the projects that we have established funding for, and we continue the conversation on the unfunded projects after adoption of the 2019 budget.
Councilmember Winterstein?
This is a request as much as anything. The preliminary budget document that we have doesn't have this information in it at all, right? And so tonight, we saw material that said, here's what's in our proposed budget, but we've already like, I think in transportation, probably need to fix that a little bit because it isn't accurate. How is that going to be reflected? How are we going to capture that in our, is there going to be a republication of the budget document with all this stuff in there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Other questions right now? Nope. Okay.
Okay, we're going to move out of capital, although I will remind you that our utility funds are combined capital and operating. So now you're just going to see those pieces together as we talk sewer, storm, and water. And I'm going to turn it over to Christina. She's going to give high-level kind of overview of those utility funds, just as we did with the general fund a couple work sessions ago.
The sewer fund, 95% of the revenue is made up of charges for services. This block could be broke down into 70% for the metro. The city collects all of this metro portion, but it's passed through for the sewage treatment that the city cannot perform. The sewer expenditures is 10.17 million. This is a consolidation of 3 expenditure streams through the sewer fund, the administration, engineering, and the maintenance ops portion. The intergovernmental services, which is 67%, is the expenditure side of the charges for services for the metro that we talked about on the resources side. PWO sewer maintenance and ops, the increase from 18 to 19 is about $175,000 to replace sewerage energy, I don't know what, dissipator, and the industrial waste permit from the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. Do I need to talk about
Sorry, Councilmember Ray.
I'm just trying to do the balance sheet here again. So for Metro, we're taking in 7.36 million, and we're giving them 6.81 million in intergovernmental services. What happens to the balance?
There's a timing issue with it.
Okay.
The questions right now?
Yeah, just to clarify, they get all their money. But it's just, we get the bill that.
No, I really
that is for the
really
previous
did get
quarter,
it.
and- Yeah.
I
just
understand the
wanted to make sure it
lag and
was
cash
understood
flow and
by
all that.
all.
No,
Right.
I wasn't being flippant. I got it.
Councilmember Ramos.
I get just one operating, and then you have salary and benefits separate. Operating is, I always think of that as the people running the thing, but I guess more it's separated into people and operating of equipment and all that separated from people. Okay, thank you.
Next slide. Down here?
We covered the work plan previously. I'm just going to touch on just a few quick things because we're talking utilities tonight. So reminder, we're doing a rate and connection charge study next year. We're also doing a variety of capital projects, our annual kind of maintenance program as well, so sewer rehab, for example. And we have a major effort that we're beginning now, we'll carry through early next year, community engagement effort in Sycamore neighborhood to talk about possibility of extension of sewers.
I'm going to take us back to October 22nd. In the presentation, we had a slide similar to this when we looked at the budget variance, and then there's also a column on the right that was in black, and it had the beginning fund balance, ending fund balance variance. So this is to help us kind of walk through that. These tables are based on that presentation. So expenditures decreased by almost $1.7 million. The reason was there was over $1 million less on capital projects and over $500,000 not spent on salaries, actually the vacancies. In 2019, the revenues and expenditures returned to the 2018 expected levels as capital projects pick up again, and the result is a net fund balance of about $300,000. So moving on to storm fund, for $6 million. Charges for services include both charges for residential, commercial, and a very small amount for vacant land. Commercial makes up 63% and residential makes up 21% of the 85% that is depicted up there. 2 grants are included in the grant piece of the pie, $530,000 from King County and about $154,000 from the State Department of Ecology. In expenditures, we have $8.3 million. This is a consolidation of 3 expenditure streams from the Stormwater Fund umbrella, administration, engineering, and the maintenance and ops. Stormwater maintenance ops from 18 to 19 increases, $128,000 or $129,000 for overtime for stormwater permit compliance and plan review, including inspection assistance and the CAD operator. The PWE operational and capital significant work program items include the stormwater maintenance plan, the IH capacity improvements, the LRIG mitigation construction, East Lake Sam Parkway drainage improvement, which was, I think, shown on an earlier slide, the lower Issaquah Creek habitat, the Westlake Sam Parkway, MPDES, love. Sunrise Place drainage stabilization, or stabilization, I should say.
On a roll?
On a roll. Same table, different fund. Stormwater fund, the expenditures in 2018 decreased by almost 3.9 million. The reason is 2.4 million decreases in the capital projects, 800,000 decrease in salary and benefits, and over 500,000 less in professional services. In 2019, the revenues increased slightly, but the return of 4.3 million in capital projects and the professional services support these projects resulted in a projected use of 2.3 million in fund balance. Water fund. Charges for services and water fund, of the 14.5 million, 8.3 million is straightforward charge for water, and about 180,000 is related to fire hydrants and meter installation. Other revenues include interest, miscellaneous rents and leases. Water fund expenditures are at 17 million. This is the consolidation of the 3 streams for water fund, administration, engineering, and the maintenance ops. Significant items on the water work program include the rate connection charge study. The last study was done in 2015. The adoption of the water system plan. The goal is to adopt this during first quarter 2019. Major capital projects in the utility are the SPAR pump station and transmission, the water treatment plant design. This is a multi-year effort. The water main replacement, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 feet of water main to be replaced in South Cove, Greenwood Point. Redundant feed for Squawk Mountain. Currently, there's 1 transmission main for the from the 297 Valley. Is that okay? And you can flip to the next slide.
Question?
Yeah.
Actually, could you go back to the revenue? 2 slides back. So that's significant. I understand charges for services. Capital contributions are what? What, I mean, where does that come from?
Those are passed through collected for Cascade Water.
We collect it and pass it through to Cascade Water. I would expect, Capital? Maybe it's just the labeling of that.
The connection charges? I can get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Ray?
That kind of I'm going to let you have a shot at it first and all that.
Well, I think our notes indicate, and Christina will double check this, it's much like how we have a capital contribution for EFR. I think we have a capital contribution for Cascade as well.
This is revenue.
Oh, it's coming.
This is revenue.
So the capital contributions, the revenue side of the equation, it is our connection charges. As a component of the connection charges, we do collect the RCFCs for the Cascade Water Lines. So a portion of the capital contributions revenue we do pass through to Cascade. The remaining portion is for connection to our system specifically, and that goes into our capital fund. Well, goes into the water fund as revenue, which we use for capital purposes. So it's the 5.27 isn't 100% ours. There's a portion that's Cascades that we pass through, and then the rest of it is ours.
Connection fees, some of it's passed through.
Correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hunt?
Well, just to clarify, and those connection fees, those are kept separate from other charges for service, which,
That's correct. Charges for service are your rates.
okay.
Did you have a follow-on question?
Well, could you go to the next slide with the expenditures? Just wondering with a 5-point, to match up what proportion goes to Cascade. It's probably represented here on the expenditures side, but it might be put together with some other expenses. I think it would be helpful just to know which portion of that funding just tracks directly from the revenue directly to the expenditures for Cascade.
So you'll find that out for us.
Yeah, finance will have to look in the books.
Got it. Councilmember Ray?
That was my question.
There we go.
It was brilliant.
All right then. So, are we going and then you'll come back to it? Or
Back to this table. Noteworthy changes, revenues in 2018 projected to increase by almost 1.6 million. The reason is the increase in charges for service and in capital contributions. Portion of the capital contributions is the pass-through for Cascade Water that the city collects. In 2019, capital contributions account for most of the $4 million increase in revenue. The $3 million increase in expenditures is due to capital projects. Overall, there's a projected use of $2.5 million in fund balance. And there has been a projected net use of fund balance every year since 2016.
So I'll ask, how do I know that this is healthy? Like, it sounds like we're running a deficit on this fund, and we did in 2016 and 2017 and 2018, and projecting in 2019, and our beginning balance goes down. So how do I know that we're
Yeah.
healthy?
Yep, that big picture comes into focus every time we do a rate study. I can tell you it looks like this. It has, in my tenure, it looks like this each year. And so part of the story is that ever-changing return to fund balance and then the utilization of it and how that gets spread between years. I've posed kind of similar questions to people who have been here longer than I have, and one of the questions that I ask each budget year is, are the planned expenditures, especially on the capital side, in line with the expectations that were set forth in the rate study and the capital plans that predated that? And the answer again this year was yes, it's all consistent with those plans. So one would have assumed a picture that looks somewhat like this each year. However, there are a couple exceptions to that. Sheldon has pointed out for me that the MPDES permit, since that seems to be a recurring sort of change that we have to shift and adjust to, has created some increases both on the operating and the capital side for us since those plans and rate studies were adopted. And so we will true up, we'll go back and incorporate that into the capital projects and the rate study in 2019. In addition, the water treatment facility, which is something that you have not yet set forth the policy that then puts us on that path, but we're projecting work in 2019 on that in the event that that's what you choose to do. And that was not included in the 2015 rate study. And so that's another place where we will have to adjust capital plans and the rates.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm not the only one that looks at it. It wonders how, it seems like a defying gravity sort of thing, but okay. Any other questions right now? Okay.
Okay, great. We're going to switch to just a handful of other what we call major funds. And before I launch into that and start to put numbers up on the screen, there are two funds that I'm going to speak briefly about. One is fleet and the other is street. And Fleet and Street Fund have had some, I would say, irregularities in the way in which we have budgeted and resourced for our expenses in those funds over my tenure here. And so it's my desire in 2019 to create more of a consistent plan for those funds so that we have better certainty about what the projected expenditures are and the revenue that would be needed to support those expenditures. We have not had for example, a multi-year plan for those funds in the same way that we do for, say, those utility funds that we just reviewed. And that creates some problems for us each year as we go to budget and we realize, expenditures are outpacing our revenues. How do we make tough decisions? So we do have a need to examine the long-term sustainability of these funds, to create a multi-year spending and resource plan for them. And I would say we have a need to do a deeper examination of our year-end cost estimation for both funds, and that's going to be something that we continue to monitor as we round out this year and as we head into next year. And I'm saying that because unlike the utility funds where we show a use of fund balance, and I feel relatively confident about that because we know we have dedicated revenue streams for those, we're showing use of fund balance in these funds for 2019, and without that long-term vision, I can say that needs to be a one-year, one-time sort of plan until we get a bigger, more consistent plan together. So we will spend 2019 in these funds with a monitoring plan so that we're watching expenditures and that we're staying at least true to this plan, if not in a better position than the plan I'm going to show you. And we will, if need be, release funds for expenditure on a more controlled fashion where we may have to kind of sequester some funds and not release them for expenditure if that revenue and expenditure picture isn't playing out the way that we had anticipated. So with no further ado.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Emily, what is the source of revenue for fleet?
For Fleet Fund, it's largely general fund dollars, and that's the issue, primary issue. We had, as you know, $1.7 million of new revenue in the general fund total.
And we have some financial policy that guides on what portion, what amount of contribution we make to fleet from general?
To some degree. So there's two pieces here, too. There's capital side, there's operating side. We do cost allocation to some degree on fleet. What we need to get better on in fleet is we have great cost allocation as it comes to kind of those operating and maintenance overhead kind of costs. So we can take our budget for mechanics and we can say we have this many vehicles that are on the general fund side of the fleet, therefore we should proportionally share those costs. What we seem to have lost touch with and that I want to get a handle on in 2019 is on the more capital side, the replacement of our assets. It appears that we had a plan with some logic and formulas behind it way back when, and now 2 or 3 finance department directors later, we're not sure how to recreate that logic. And so in the fleet budget in particular, we have had a growing fund balance. And because the revenue has been somewhat constrained because it's a general fund revenue, we have, I will say, perhaps artificially limited the number of vehicle replacements that we're doing every year. And so this year, we are using fund balance to maybe catch up on some of those replacements. So in recent history, when local economy wasn't as great, national economy wasn't as great, we sort of took a pass for a while and didn't replace as many vehicles. That's starting to catch up. And yet we didn't adjust the charges to departments. So we kept collecting the revenue, but we weren't spending it as thoughtfully, I think, as we could have on those replacements. And so this is a little bit of catch-up. We're going to do some replacements in 2019, but we are also going to work on that long-term revenue and expenditure plan so that we have good, solid logic.
Councilmember Ramos?
Yeah, so trying to relate this back and getting these numbers, because if I remember right, earlier in the capital one, it had a $600,000 value for fleet. And I'm assuming that was fleet replacement. It was the capital side only, right? So this is operating costs for the fleet as well, or what? Because we're in the $3 million range, not the $600,000 range. So I'm trying to figure out how.
Correct.
So it's all the full operating
everything.
costs of all fleet and equipment, or is equipment
correct.
done separately through?
No, this also includes, maybe if I go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about specifics
Okay.
in this. So 1.4, there should be an M there, $1.4 million of the fleet expenditures on that previous slide are related to capital machinery and equipment. 337,000 goes to EFR to help pay for a replacement of apparatus. And about 815,000 is for replacement vehicles and equipment. And then the rest, about 250,000, would be for some new vehicles that are needed, either because we don't have appropriate tools, we have new staff that come with vehicles. So if those staff, we don't proceed with those staff, that's a number that also gets adjusted.
Councilmember, oh, sorry, follow on.
Well, just follow up to, so I'm trying to find that $600,000.
Yeah, I think it's
Number in here
I think it's
doesn't-
part of that. We'll double check this, but I think it's part of the 815. And again, it's about which funds get charged for which components of the fleet replacement plan.
Okay.
Okay, even more fun. Street. So street operating, we have had a not so rosy picture my tenure here. Last year, we had a similar story to tell on screen, and it doesn't get better. So I'm eager to also spend some time in 2019 trying to figure out a long-term sustainability plan for street operating. Last year, for example, we showed a decrease in fund balance in the street operating fund. And again here, you can see similar pattern. This can't be sustainable for very long, and yep. So, and again, I'll remind you that that those columns that reflect sort of beginning year fund balance and ending year fund balance and the projection, all of those change to some degree by the time we close the books on 2018. So one of the things I'm committing to you on is, as we have this monitoring plan going forward into 2019, we will also provide you with a status update, a year-end status update, to let you know where we are with these funds and the others. But we need to look at what are the revenue sources for this fund and whether or not those can produce enough to sustain our operating expenditures in this division. This is the group that takes care of our roads and is responsible for a huge aspect of our public safety. We had a significant, REIT is one of the funding sources here, and those of you who were here last year for budget know that we made a significant use of REIT last year, and so part of the story is these one-year plans come home to roost, and we didn't have that option this year with REIT. So we do need to look at sustainable funding strategies for our street operating fund.
Councilmember Winterstein, did you have a question?
I think I parsed out of what she said. I think revenue, probably, we move it over from general fund, but there may be some cost allocation that we get from other departments as well. And expenditures are, it's not really equipment, it is to pay for the people and operations that maintain the streets. You know, this is my 7th budget, and I don't know why I have a hard time remembering this one and what it is. Because we deal with, so much we deal with is in streets is capital, and we're talking about projects. But this is really just about, this is separated just about the people and machinery that we used and expenses for maintaining, fixing potholes, for
Right,
example.
so there are commodities, yes, as well in this.
All right.
Are these also the folks who salt Mount Olympus when there's ice?
Yes, sir.
Well, for those of us who live up on Squawk Mountain, that's an easy way for me to remember this one.
As long as they do it before it snows.
Can we talk about the sources though? I mean, I'm really unclear. So, I mean, there's a general fund component, I guess, and are there other revenue sources here that we apply, or is this something where we have the ability to allocate general funds to this?
A significant amount of general funds, or what you would call general fund revenue. Same revenue sources that support the rest of our general fund, support street operating funds. And I'm having Christina pull up exact numbers for how to break down that revenue that's going into street operating.
So for 2019, there's transfer in from general fund of 2 million, and then $1 million from REIT. REIT,
Was that 2018 or 2019?
2019.
I thought we said we couldn't do that again with REIT.
REIT goes to a few different locations. So my comment about REIT was that overall in the REIT fund, we utilize a lot more of it, including the balance in the REIT fund, in order to support all the things that REIT does support in our budget. One of those is street operating. I think I thought I had the number for previous year on REIT. If that's of interest, we can pull that too.
So let me reiterate that. So 2 million from the general fund, 1 million from REIT, and then another 900,000 from.
Question mark.
That's beginning fund balance.
Sorry, can you say that a little louder?
Beginning fund balance is 0.9.
Beginning fund balance of the fund.
I'm still looking at revenue up there, and it says 3.9, right?
Yeah.
Is it subtracted in there? Doesn't work.
5.1.
Oh, well. Sorry. There's a little bit from the motor vehicle excise tax and some grants. About 800,000.
Okay.
All right, Councilmember Ramos.
So just to be clear, that we basically choose to fund this however much we want. It's under our control of, right now we're using REIT as well as general fund predominantly, and maybe a little bit of taxes that we'll get from something else. But it's pretty much, we decide what to put in this pot and how much we're going to spend on our street fund, right?
Yes, as is the case every year with everything, but if we want to maintain the level of service, this is, basically what it costs. We have $5 million worth of expenses, and each year we need to find revenue to support that. And like we spoke about, it's commodities to do the same things that we did the year before. It's the same amount of people.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I'm saying we have that control. We're saying it costs $5 million, 5.1 to run the program, and we're only allocating 3.9 to pay for that, and which leaves us in the hole at the end of the year. So that's on us to look at that, I guess, is my statement to that. That's our control. And then just one last thing that follows through with that. We also have 900-some thousand for overlayment. And that's totally separate from this. Is that correct? We also choose how much money to put in that program as well. It's just shy of $1 million. Yeah, because that's in capital, but that's we also.
What, at least we used to call the street improvement fund, right? Wasn't there a street improvement?
Well, now it's overlayment because it's strictly we don't do that, but yeah, don't go there. But that's also another piece of maintaining our streets, and we control how much we put into that fund as well.
Well, that's one that we can choose more or less in a given year, right?
Yes.
But like the salting, to go back to my example, we can't choose not to salt Mount Olympus Drive when it snows, right? It's just a basic function of an orderly municipality, right? But yeah, choosing when to fix a pothole is different.
I don't think there's any, I think everyone is kind of cool with the expenditure side of this thing. And I think to Councilmember Ramos's point, I mean, we're showing in this budget as proposed, we're showing a negative fund balance, and it's well within our control. It's not like we have restricted funds here. We can build this up if we choose to. Well, we have to build it up if that's what it costs to provide the service.
But what we probably can't do is just use general fund ending balance, right? Because we've said that we're not going to use ending fund balance to essentially tar paper over fundamental fiscal challenges, right? We're going to use ending fund balance for special projects and one-time uses and whatnot. So we don't want to, I don't know the right way to address this question, but I would certainly want to make sure that we're not inadvertently doing that, right?
Yes, it would be against my better professional judgment to pay for ongoing expenses out of fund balance. Yes.
Right, and against our
And
stated
against
fiscal
your
policy.
policy.
Yes.
Indeed.
But as I was trying to point out, if we're running a deficit here, and we get to, if we're getting to that fund balance, then we may say, we have to fund this, so we may have to take something else out. That's the trade I'm seeing here when we're not paying what it costs. As you said, we have some abilities to limit some things, but the cost of doing that, the ongoing thing, we can't rely on Domino's road patching program to save ourselves here.
I'm just saying amongst the options that we have to address this, one that we do not have is to use ending fund balance.
That's correct. But we can make that
General
decision before we get to that point by other manipulations.
I don't know if manipulations is the right word, but we have to figure out how to, so how do we, when and how do we get our arms around this?
So I'm asking you to allow me to have some time to get my arms wrapped around it first. We need to do a deep dive in this program and kind of look at our costs, review the cost allocation structures that are inherent in this, review revenue sources, and we need to come back with recommendation. While I don't like this picture, and I don't want to repeat this picture, I know this picture is changing every day, and so we will report back to you and let you know how we ended the year. Again, what 2019 is looking more accurately like, and then my intent is during the first quarter of the year is to deep dive on this and then be able to come back with recommendations so that as we approach budget development for next year, we will be in a better spot.
Got it. So we should sort of take a mental Polaroid, put it in the same place as the $13.3 million from the seat cushions, and come back to it early next year.
Yes, please.
Any other questions at the moment? Councilmember Hunt.
Is the recommendation going to be some combination of transfers in as a policy about how to address this when it comes up, or is it some other mechanism?
It could. I think we've got to get a clear vision of the scope, the extent of the issue. It may be that it can be solved through changing the way that the transfers are working or what the proportional share is. It's probably not a sustainable solution to just, for example, adjust the general fund contribution to the street operating because we have limited capacity there year over year. So I suspect it's also going to be a recommendation on, it's going to be a combination, examining our expenditures, examining possible revenue sources. It may result in us recommending pursuit of an additional revenue source for this.
Other questions? Nope. All right.
I'm going to touch on a couple other funds that you may have noted in the fund summary. The LID number 24 debt service, we report as a negative fund balance, and I wanted to touch on that. We have an SAO at the State Auditor's Office of Washington has a requirement for us to reclassify the investment. This happened a couple of years ago, I think. For the first time, the total debt is being shown as a liability in the fund, and this is just because of the type of liability that it is. So that's why it's a negative fund balance. You'll see it decrease over time. In prior years, only the current portion was reported, so that's why we had a big jump. The second fund is the Municipal Facilities Capital Fund. Currently, we have been showing that as a negative, about $285,000 in fund balance. As Emily spoke to earlier, we're always kind of changing and fine-tuning, and as we reported on Monday, there was some savings with the pool facility. And so we have taken the $280,000 with that savings, and then savings from the dispatch console purchase, which is in the CIP as well. So we're back down to a zero. So we can update our fund summary for you, but that's just an example of how things are kind of changing for our budget.
All right.
Okay, next.
Next major topic.
We're going to go to what we call City Gives, which is city contributions to a variety of nonprofits and community partners. And David Fujimoto is here to help review this.
Good evening, council members. David Fujimoto, Sustainability Director. I'm here just to give a quick overview of what Emily described as City Gives, and we had also discussed a bit about this with the Services Committee this fall, and there was also a specific presentation on the Community Fund that happened this summer. There are some additional details that are going to be coming forth on the Arts Fund. I believe that's slated for services this month, as well as the Human Services Commission's recommendations for grant funds. So real quickly, high-level overview, 4 different kind of primary categories of funding the city provides for a variety of services and programs and capacity building in the community. There are also some in-kind related services, which we're not going to go into tonight, but that is things like reduced rents, city participates on some boards and commissions, things like that. Some of those pieces will be looked at as part of 2019 work program, but not a focus of this conversation currently. So as I mentioned before, arts grants, human services grants, community fund grants, so 3 grant programs, and then another category of contracts for services where we work with nonprofit organizations to provide services on behalf of the city. Real quickly, arts grants, as I mentioned, in the preliminary budget is just over $170,000 for next year. This is a slight increase over the current year funding support. There are 25 organizations that are recommended for funding. These will be coming forward to the Services and Safety Committee via agenda bill that's currently in process. And the projects in this category are chosen based on artistic merit and quality of the project, whether or not they provide a broad spectrum of benefit to the general public and the Issaquah community. Also relates to the fiscal stability and capability of the applicant, diversity of funding sources, and the ability of an applicant to plan and perform on the proposal that's involved. So really funds for arts programming. Human services grants are, in this case, are funds to provide for services to our community members. $495,000 is proposed in the preliminary budget. This was a funding level that was identified through a conversation earlier this year before we went into the RFP or request for proposal process under earlier agenda bill. It is an increase from the prior 2-year funding cycle, and it follows a 2-year funding cycle. And again, these recommendations are going to be coming forward from our Human Services Commission. Our Services Committee will have a presentation this month on these. These are generally categorized into 5 different goal areas, and you can see a quick summary of the dollar values that are going to be proposed. Yes?
David, so, I'm sorry, we set a target of $371,000 a year, a biennium?
So we set a target of $495,000 the prior, and so we have a 2-year granting process.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I guess the other point that's not included here is with the, and you'll hear more about this with the presentation from the commission, but there was a substantial increase in requests that came through for this. There's about $1.1 million in total requests that came through to the city. This was about, and we also saw a dramatic increase in the number of applicants who came forward. So something like a 23% increase in applicants and a 58% increase in grant requests.
Councilmember Winterstein?
I think, David, it seems like the timing of this has shifted. I do recall previously in budget time that we did have the recommendations. Now you're saying, so what's that February date? What are we going to be considering in February at that agenda bill?
So in this past February, in February of 2018, there was an agenda bill, the 74.
Okay, that set the 495.
Yeah, so that was setting the funding level, or so basically helping the commission to understand what they should be aiming for as they're reviewing and going through their deliberation process.
Okay, and we are going to see their recommendation.
And so the recommendations are coming forward. There's an agenda bill that was referred at the last council meeting, actually, in October, actually, to services next Wednesday.
And I'll just add, I mentioned this at council leadership meeting this morning. It's a little awkward in that services meets the day after you have your November 13th deliberations on the budget, but we do expect, they've made sizable efforts to stay within the 495. What you'll be getting is therefore better accounting of which groups are being funded at what levels within these categories.
Thank you. That's correct. Okay. The next category is community fund grants. And these grants, if you can think about them as really to provide for capacity building within our local nonprofit organizations. This is a program that's gone through some changes and some refinements over the past couple of years. Used to be called the Mayor's Funds Grants, but I think trying to provide some additional clarity both to the applicants and to the reviewing process. These were reviewed by a committee that included representatives from the Parks Board, the Human Services Commission, Arts Commission, and Economic Vitality Commission. So there was a reviewing body that made these recommendations. So there's $92,275 in the proposed budget. This is a slight difference from 2018, but in the review, a couple of the proposals were recommended for contracts for services as opposed to capacity building grants. So you'll see those reflected in the contracts for services, which is the next slide.
Before you move on.
Yes.
So how are we, the council, going to be addressing this question? I understand the bill regarding the human services grants. Is this it? This is we're doing this one as a committee of the whole. There are the numbers, and we're going to make a decision on if this is how we agree with the recommendation. Is there any other review of this?
No. It's during your final deliberations on the budget. So this is a recommendation from that committee.
Okay, and what additional information are we going to get other than this slide?
If you would like to see, a little summary paragraph about intended use of these funds, we can provide that.
Yeah, well, we've also seen in the past with, like, I know the human services grants, like we saw what people asked for, we saw what they got, we maybe saw what they got the year before, and there's always been this somewhat of a kind of a running tally, and we also had access to some of the, I don't know if it was a summary or the applications themselves, but I'm sure there's a certain level of detail that's going to go to services on human services. And I think some of the historical record for this as well would be very good, and especially like what was asked for and what was received this year as well, like we've reported before.
And we made a presentation to the Services Committee, I forget the date of that meeting, where we did provide historical information across the different types of funding for each of the organizations that have been funded. So that's been provided to services.
When was that?
That's what
it was in September, and then there was also a presentation to the whole council in August.
Okay, so these are just from that. That's
correct.
Okay.
So, but we can certainly provide that summary so you have that information readily at hand.
Yeah, August.
I think it was
August was a decade
September
ago.
18th.
It was late out then. Okay, and as I mentioned before, the other primary category is contracts for services and also some sponsorships. The city provides for contracts for the delivery of a variety of different services. Historically, they've included the Historical Society, Mountains to Sound, and Fish. The new additions this year are the Friends of Lake Sammamish, Issaquah Alps Trails Club, and those were based on recommendations as we reviewed proposals that came in and were reviewed by that committee. So those are the different pieces. They're more to support some services that they provide to the community, whether it's volunteer coordination, delivery of education, volunteer trail maintenance, those kinds of activities for the Alps Trails Club, programming, events, education, activating park activities, things like that with Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park.
So I've seen this on previous years, and I've never asked about it, but what's the rationale for, so Leadership Eastside, I assume that's like a scholarship type deal for folks who can't afford the dues?
No, it's actually two pieces. For the city of Issaquah, it is, we call it sponsorship because it helps to support that program, so it builds that capacity of leadership, which we think as a community we benefit from. So it's support for the organization. It also enables the city to make a recommendation for a participant. Usually there's a city staff member or two that participates in Leadership East Side to grow their leadership capabilities.
So I'm not going to propose taking it out, but at some point, not tonight, I would like to understand better what Leadership Eastside does. Like I get what the Historical Society does. I get what Mountains to Sound Greenway does. I get what Issaquah Alps Trails Club does. But I've just never really, I know that there are people that are in Leadership Eastside and they say great things about it, but I don't really understand how it's on the same list with all these others.
Sure, be happy to provide a little overview of what they do.
All right, great. Questions? Council Deputy President Batiste?
Thank you, David, for the presentation. Could you let me know, I think you had talked about that there were a couple of groups that came out of the community fund and then moved over to contracts for service?
Yes. So those were the Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park and the Issaquah Alps Trails Club.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So Member Ray.
So just some clarification. So I think Human Services Grants has a little different treatment than all of the other components of this, because in February with Agenda Bill 7479, we set a target that then was the basis for planning Human Services Grants for the Human Services Commission to work with. Thanks, Paul. The other components, the community fund, et cetera, when you came to services, we talked about a retrospective, what was being spent and on who in 2018. So we didn't really, in those meetings, we did not talk about what was the target for 2019, as I recall. Am I wrong?
I believe it included, I think at that point in time, we knew the preliminary numbers for the community fund for certain. The arts fund, I believe, they've just finished their deliberations, so I don't think that those numbers were known, but where we had 2019 numbers, I believe they were provided with that material. But you are correct, there was not a formal process for establishing a target early in the year like there was with the Human Services Commission.
So I think that we've already, we've deliberated hard on the Human Services Grants for 2019, but we've not gone through that same level of review on the other parts of City Gives.
So there is a deliberative process for the Arts Commission to review the arts grants and make recommendations. So we do have that body that's in place for that grant process.
Let me try that again.
Okay.
The council really hasn't deliberated on those funds.
Correct, yes. And part of it, as you alluded to, is timing, because that agenda bill is now coming forward to services.
Councilmember Winterstein.
David, regarding the community funds, so you briefly mentioned that there was a different approach this year. I think it's just was maybe, this has evolved quite a bit.
Yes.
Over the last few years, and I think it was the mayor's fund or whatever we call it, right? And then staff came up with, I think, another idea, which was brilliant, and it's a very unique opportunity to actually help organizations that are in the building capacity, whether that be for capital or for staff development or something like that, which is a unique opportunity, but I think it's very critical to help them succeed. I mean, because it's very difficult for these nonprofits to fund things like staff development. And it helps in many ways. So I think it's unique. But we changed even for this recommendation represents a new way. And I hadn't heard of, and maybe you told me, I don't remember. Thanks, Emily. That of all that came across our desk over the course of the year. Could you just summarize again what we did different here?
In fact, I think and maybe Emily, you can help me out with this, but I believe the panel that did the review, I believe that was in place the last time. And so really, I think it was, you're shaking your, okay, maybe that's incorrect. So thank you. Please.
Sure. I think the panel was new this year.
Okay.
Previously, the 2 years ago was the first year we put kind of criteria, parameters around what the funds could be used for.
And
So
opened it up.
Yes, and opened it up. So we said, we're going to make funds available for that capacity building purpose, and we invited nonprofits to respond. So that was 2 years ago. Then this year, we said, okay, now let's make improvements on who is actually screening those, applying the criteria, reviewing, prioritizing, et cetera. And so this year, we developed that community panel with individuals from your various boards and commissions to serve in that capacity. What I would say about the amount is, unlike human services, where we go through an exercise to set a funding target with all of you to provide direction then to the board, here, so far, because the ask has been relatively small and because the purpose is very narrow, we have we have been able to fund those applications that we felt met the criteria. At some point in time, we probably will need to also add a new component to the program and say, what's the ideal level of funding we would like to reserve for this? And then that'll be our cap. So far, we have not needed to do that. While we did have more funding requests and than we were able to support. My understanding is some of those applications were not recommended for funding because the panel didn't feel they met sort of the letter or spirit of the parameters for the funding.
Okay, and so David, you said when was this in front of council before?
I believe it was in August.
So we didn't have a work session in August. I think that was
Let me
canceled.
double check.
There was a meeting in July, and then a services meeting took place in September with some of this information.
Right, thank you.
Okay, okay. Oh,
Sorry.
So you're saying I will.
July 24th was the date.
July 24th was, I'm looking at the material. Okay, sorry, Tola, just to finish up. Okay, and I'll review that, but will I find in there, I mean, what we've done historically with this?
So what you'll find in there is a memo, I believe it's from Amy Dukes, in regards to the process and some background on the community fund, as well as the recommendations of the fund. What we can provide is, and actually I believe there was some historical data that was included with that, that showed what the funding levels were like in prior years.
So first, Council Deputy President Batiste.
Thank you. David, could you remind me, and maybe this is for Emily as well, the contracts for service and the sponsorships under other funding sources, the process for determining those amounts?
We don't have the same sort of RFP process, so these are activities and partnerships that the city has historically taken part in.
And so those are typical from years past,
Correct.
even though we've moved a couple groups in
Correct.
and rearranged some things, but those are the typical amounts from years past.
That's correct.
With those groups.
Next, Councilmember Ramos.
Yes, just to kind of reiterate for me clarity on the community fund grants. So as they've been going on, and we definitely have been focused on capacity building these last few years, and talk about particularly, to me, younger nonprofits, not established ones, really need to kind of impetus to really get going. And we have a lot of very well-established folks on this list, and they still can also build capacity as well. And then, to my memory, some of this was reduced because some of these folks would come back a third year asking for the same thing, and we moved them to contract for service because we said they're doing a good thing, but it's not really capacity building anymore, because that's something you should do in 1 or 2 years, get that going, and then that should be an end to that. And that's why some of those folks were moved to contract for services, because we wanted to still fund them to do what they're doing, but it no longer met the spirit of that. I'm correct in reiterating that, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So just want to mention that because we have some very established and some, everything from, been around a long time and very big folks like Village Theater that are, a multi-million-dollar operation versus, some smaller, influence choice folks, right? So we got quite a range on there and how that helps the stuff, and trying to keep that focus on that capacity building where other ones that are long-going, more operational kinds of things and help assisting those things fit under some things other than this.
And I want to just add to that, I think that's a fair statement that the organizations are building capacity in a variety of different ways. So some organizations might be more focused on capital or technology improvements. There have been a number of agencies that have benefited from CRM, customer relationship management approaches, as their donor base changes or their ability to serve clients changes, or the various needs of working with various artists or others that are associated with their programs. So that happens in a variety of different ways as the kind of conditions change or the landscape changes with these different organizations.
Right, and then just to reiterate, there's a number of sources here. A number of these groups get funding from different pots to help them in kind of different categories of what they're doing and how they're assisting the community, such as, some art, some more human services, and overlap some of those. Great, thank you.
Councilmember Hunt, did you still have a question?
It's more of a comment. When we talked about this previously, I had some confusion around the criteria that was being used for moving those specific organizations into contract for service. I am glad that they're being funded via a mechanism, because I think the work they do, as well as the work that are funded by the community fund grant recipients, is extremely important. But I did at that time ask for the RFP that was sent out, and I think that while it does talk about capacity, especially since as we're thinking about how much we're funding in different buckets and really wanting applicants to target the right sources of funding, my comment on the RFP is that it would be good to mirror the scope or the criteria that are used by the commission that looks at these, because I think it does leave a lot of ambiguity in terms of, it says you can have eligible projects, would be organizational, professional development, et cetera, and so it could be, I think, used to more target the funding.
Okay. Councilmember Winterstein.
David, I found it. I'm looking at the July 24th copy of the whole document.
I steered you wrong, yes.
A couple things jump out. One is, in that document, Highlands Council is identified as receiving $4,500. This says $26,250. You might want to go look.
It does indeed. I believe that's a typo. Because Friends of Lake Sammamish is the 26,250. Thank you.
What was that last comment? I'm sorry.
So under the contracts for services, Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park is 26,250. So I believe that was an error.
And the Alps Club is in there as well,
Yeah,
in the July 24th memo.
correct.
And that's the other one that was moved over after this.
Correct.
Correct.
I'm sorry, do you have a follow-on?
So all the packet, so that packet has the complete history in it. Okay, all right.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure.
So maybe I'll just ask similarly, sort of, I'm sorry, so again, why is the, total different from July than is today?
So the total in the July presentation on the community fund, it included both the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and Friends of the Lake Sammamish State Park in there.
Which got moved over.
Where it got moved over to
Okay.
contracts for services.
I mean, so this comes out of a citizen commission, and then we saw it in July, and so today it's really just, by the way, gang, you said this was good in July, or we told you in July this was our intention, and here we are in November with what we said we were going to do in July. Is that?
I believe it was sharing the information at that point in time, identifying some questions, so there was some additional clarity that was provided to services on kind of what the whole picture looked like. And this is more around the decision point on whether or not to proceed with that budgetary amount.
Got it. Okay, because I'm just trying to understand, because I remember the old days where we had everybody come into services and they brought their glossy brochures and all that kind of stuff, and I'm just trying to understand. Obviously, we moved away from that sort of a model, and I get that. I just wanted to make sure I understand the oversight piece, so I appreciate it. Any other questions? All right.
That's great. The only other piece here was related to the ARCH funding, and I believe that, yeah, and I'll let Emily cover that, please.
Okay, great, thanks. We've talked about this before, and I said during final deliberations, this is the moment in time that you get to decide on this piece. There were 3 pieces that we've talked about with recommendations from the ARCH Executive Board. You already took action on the technical update to the parity formula. Second piece that we're holding for future time is a conversation about setting an aspirational goal for the ARCH Housing Trust Fund. And the third piece is what would you like your 2019 contribution to be? There's 2 pieces of contribution that go to ARCH from the city's budget on an annual basis. One is the administrative fee. That's just our contribution to the staffing and overhead costs to run ARCH. To be our kind of housing unit. And then the second is the Housing Trust Fund contribution. Again, this is, we have the parity goals that set targets, a min and a max. There's different ways to achieve that target in any year or over time. But typically the city has contributed something from its general fund, as have all the other members typically. And this year in the budget, we have $100,000 budgeted and approved, and the mayor has recommended that we budget an additional $50,000 to go to the Housing Trust Fund in an effort to support increasing the amount of affordable housing units in East King County.
Questions? Councilmember Hunt.
So you said that there was the 100,000 that was approved, but the parity formula would require 153. Is that because that was an update this year, or it wasn't?
Yes. So we have anticipated, it's been a 3-year conversation with ARCH to make these updates to the parity formula. So we knew it was coming. And so 2 years ago, I recommended that we start smoothing that curve. So 2 years ago, we were at 50,000. This year, we approved a budget for 100,000. The new min is indeed 153,000. And so we'd like to get closer to that minimum target in 2019.
Next, Councilmember Ramos.
I guess I'm confused on the numbers a little bit. Administrative fee I have, but then it says Housing Trust Fund contributes 150, but I heard you say 100, and then with a $50,000 increase, or 50, yeah, and so I'm trying, but it says 150 on top, then 153 and then 50, so I'm.
Yep. So the 2018 adopted budget is 100,000. Our preliminary budget, the mayor's recommended budget, is 150,000 for 2019. That's still $3,000 less than what our new target minimum will be for ARCH in 2019, provided that the executive board actually implements that new target. All of the other member city councils are taking action on that technical update to the parity formula right now.
I just had my number, 18 and 19 numbers slightly confused the way it was written there. Thank you.
Councilmember Wright.
Can we get a copy of the parity formula? I'm just curious about how that all works. That would be
Certainly.
really helpful. Thank you.
Other questions?
Well, that's the 50,000 one. The 153,000 is coming a little bit later, I guess. And is there we're just listening to this now and more deliberations later when we get there. Seems like maybe 3,000 off of what they're requesting is
So,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So this was done before you got the $153,000 number. You got to the 150, right? Before you saw the number was 153,000?
No, I was aware that it was going to be 153. Like I said, they're voluntary targets,
Right.
so
Yep, yep.
Getting close is great. There's other ways that we can meet either the min or even exceed the max through land dedication, fee waiver, et cetera. It's just been city practice to contribute at least at the minimum level through a general fund cash contribution.
Right. So I guess my comment is from 150 to 153, I'd be versus 3,000 short of request seems.
you would just go for the,
Yeah, the extra 3,000, yeah.
just go for the gold.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Councilmember Hunt.
I agree.
Other comments? All right. Thanks for
Great.
explaining that. Next.
Yes, last. I want to talk a little bit about use of fund balance.
Last, but certainly not least.
Not least, that's true. I know this has been of interest to council, and when we started the budget presentations, we, of course, gave you that summary, all funds summary, total budget summary, and so you're well aware that the estimated beginning year fund balance is about $23.5 million. That's 45% of our anticipated expenditures of $52.7 million. And I will say there's different logic. Our policy bases it on a percentage of expenditures. There are other places that do it on revenues. And so there are different ways to look at what our target should be, but that's what our current policy is. It's reflected here. General fund assigned fund balance should be approximately 15 to 20% of expenditures of the general fund. So we are over that, $13 million higher than that 20% maximum target. So that therefore poses a question. Is it okay to be at that level, to remain at that level? And so I'm going to share just a couple other little tidbits from your policy. It says that reserves above the targeted reserve levels may be used for new expenditures with emphasis on one-time uses that achieve future operating cost reductions, capital asset investments with the long-term benefit, or prepaying existing debt. Use of excess reserves will be determined by the City Council through the next available budget cycle or budget amendment defined through an agenda bill. So there's not a clear requirement that you have to, in any given budget year, spend down to your target max through your budget deliberations. You also have the avenue of, at any moment in time, utilizing fund balance through an agenda bill that brings forward an appropriation. Your policy is more specific, of course, on if you fall below the minimum. It says you need to work hard to get back above the minimum. You need to have a plan, even if you're not able to do that in that next year. We also have two other kind of related policies that I wanted to remind you of. One is that policy about replenishing reserves, which I've just spoken about. You also have a section that is called excess reserves, and it says reserves above the targeted reserve level may be used for these purposes, and also it mentions in a couple places a little broader use. So I think your policy is very clear that you shouldn't use it for ongoing expenses, but the opportunities to use it for other one-time uses is fairly broad. Some communities narrow the uses of fund balance, or they have a fund balance sort of program where if they're over their max by a certain amount, then a percentage of that overage gets almost automatically siphoned off and dedicated towards something. Oftentimes, it's toward a particular capital account. So that's an option that council could consider. Of course, there are a variety of other one-time uses that I know are on radar screens that you could also choose to use some fund balance for. It would not be my recommendation to spend down all the way to your max, and I'm going to talk about that, why I wouldn't recommend that. I also wanted to remind you that you have a separate contingency fund that we established 2-ish years ago, and it has a lesser amount. I was going to say minimal, but 300,000 is not something to sneeze at, but it's a small amount of funds. It has more restricted uses to it. So this fund balance is the place where we have the greatest flexibility. So it's important to keep that in mind. We talked about this. This is just another way to depict it. I, on this slide, suggest, as an example, that you could choose to keep a little cushion in your fund balance because it is your most flexible source of funding. And you could, for example, choose to use some available reserves so that you brought down to the 25% mark, and that would consist of using about $8.3 million. I wanted to remind you of advantages. So having this fund balance does allow you to respond to emergent issues. It can allow us to borrow in more strategic ways and avoid some debt service or interest avoid debt service or interest costs by not borrowing, or utilizing some of the fund balance to pay off debt. It's cash, so it's quick to access. And the disadvantages, though, are that if you spend it, of course, we don't have the ability to respond very quickly in emergencies. It's when we have funding sources that are either property tax based and fluctuate, albeit not quite as much as other communities across the country because of our property tax limitation, but property values change from year to year. Sales behavior changes from year to year, and having some available fund balance can provide a cushion year to year as you see changes in the local economy. Also, if you take your one-time cash out and you pay for a longer-term investment, then a disadvantage might be that you're not sharing those costs with people in the future that are going to benefit from that investment, or you're paying for it all at one time where you might have opportunities to spread it out over time. So I just wanted to make sure that we had expressed all of that. So this is oversimplification, but I think you've got maybe 3 choices here. One is always do nothing, continue to hold that amount in fund balance as ongoing reserves. Second would be to have some discussion about how to use it for one-time uses, for priority items. And then third would be to develop a plan and begin to spend it or spend it over time according to that plan. There are a few things as we have developed this budget that I mentioned to you very early on would be opportunities for use of fund balance. We talked about how we only had $1.7 million of new revenue in the general fund, and how the reauthorizations from 2018 put a burden on the use of that new revenue in 2019. So there are opportunities, for example, to pull out some one-time items from the 2019 preliminary budget and fund them through use of fund balance where they were budgeted, say, the previous year in some cases, and you would therefore then create capacity in your preliminary budget where you could spend for other priorities that you might have. One in particular is senior center operations. That's going to be on your final deliberations list. We spoke about it last time. We only have the interim model costs in the preliminary budget now, but if you wanted to build that into your ongoing operating budget, you could take out some of those one-time items that we utilized that $1.7 million of new revenue for and spend it as if it was one time out of fund balance. Also, capital projects, you have several capital projects that are unfunded. You might look at those for opportunities. Some of those are probably better candidates for borrowing, which we have talked about. And I would suggest only using your fund balance on those capital investments that you might also have an opportunity for a revenue reimbursement or a return to your general operating or to your fund balance in the future through new revenue sources that would be generated from those capital assets. I would borrow and or secure a new revenue source for those longer term and bigger capital investments.
Sorry, can you say that again? So for things where we would expect to have them be revenue generating, you would not recommend using an ending fund balance? Because those things will hypothetically pay for themselves over time.
Opposite, I'm saying they're one time, so you get bigger bang for the buck if you can spend by the asset first and then get all the cash as new cash over future years. You could also keep your fund balance at this higher level in anticipation of larger expenditures, new expenditures, for example, related to implementation of strategic plan items that we have not yet described. We haven't adopted a strategic plan yet, but you could anticipate that need or other capital or operating needs in the future.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Emily, the contingency fund, you say that has restrictions. Can you tell me those off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, but I can
Okay.
put my finger to it in a second. I'm going to have to get back to you. I thought that was
Okay,
tucked in
the
here.
details maybe, but it's interesting. I think somewhere in this narrative you just gave, I mean, you did talk about that's one of the advantages or the purposes that we could have for use of the general fund balance, that there could be some unexpected need. It could be emergency related. And that's, of course, exactly, I think, what the contingency fund was set aside for. And therefore, so that type of event would qualify for use of contingency funds. And I point that out because I've actually been disappointed that since we created that fund, we made one contribution to it. We haven't even considered anything since. And I wish we had, and I think that was the intent when we first created it. If we still think that it would be better. Yes, I realize it's more restricted, but to me, that's the discipline in that always was, is that, a portion of this cash in hand that we have in reserves, let's really make sure that we don't touch it unless there's an emergency. That's why we set up that contingency fund. So it seems to me we should continue. We never really figured out what the right level was.
Right.
But to say that, well, let's hold it in the general fund, because we might need it for emergency. Well, that if we think we're doing that, then I say move it over to contingency, because that is the purpose of that fund. Then we know it's going to be protected and be available when those emergency arises. So that's
Yes.
as much for my colleagues as for you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I was looking, the only reference that I had, and Christina's looking this up now, it may not say as much as I actually thought it said. I have 2.5.3 contingency fund. The city of Issaquah may establish a separate special revenue fund for contingencies or may adequately set aside assigned or committed reserves within the general fund for unforeseen expenditures. So I'm not sure if there's additional language. Nope, that's it. I thought there were more strings attached to it. I think that was the intent, but I also, like you, believe we didn't get quite that far because we only put a small amount in. If you think back to the Talus 9 slide, we needed a lot more than 300,000, and so I think we haven't had those conversations about what right size for emergency use would be. Some of our other funds also have suggested targets that aren't completely thought out either. So we say utility funds, for example, or special revenue funds should have reserve levels, but in some cases they don't even specify a percentage. So there's still a lot of work that we should do talking about suitable levels of reserves.
So you're not looking for us to make a decision amongst these three options this evening, or you are looking for us to make a decision?
I'm not. I know it's on your minds, and I wanted to make sure that we started to talk about possibilities and that we were all clear on what we're compelled to do and not compelled to do.
So does anybody have any other thoughts on the subject right now as you see what's the options that have been sort of put out in front of us? Is there anybody who feels dead set that we should absolutely consider spending some of this, feel dead set we should absolutely not, feel dead set we should put it all in contingency? Thoughts? Councilmember Ray, you look pensive.
I have a thought, and it kind of goes like this. Particularly on issues where the reason that the fund balance increased is because we had planned to spend something in 18 and we rolled it into 19 and reauthorized it. I think that is an appropriate use of fund balances. And if that then frees up funding for some other things that we would like to do, I think that makes a lot of sense. Because if we had spent it in 18, it would have been done and we wouldn't have the money. And so if we spend that money in 19, it'll be done and we won't have the money and we're net the same place. So I'd like to be able to tease apart those items where we think we have reauthorized expenditures and give some serious consideration to using our fund balances to cover those expenditures.
Would you say preferentially towards things that were general fund or things that we had to roll forward in other funds as well?
I think in this case, since we're talking general fund balance, it would be general fund stuff.
Okay. I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, I think we could also have that same discussion with the other funds where the fund balances have increased and we've reauthorized. We would use, but I think that's already in the capital plan.
Councilmember Winterstein?
I don't have as developed maybe an idea as that, but I do know that we have some really big numbers next to some unfunded capital. So I think how I'd like to see us proceed is to not come up with some kind of policy for this, develop a plan. We have been saying for a while, we've been putting the expectation upon ourselves to do something, I think, about those transportation projects and from a capital perspective. And I would like to still have what we have in reserves and general fund to be, fully available for us to consider. And I'm not saying, and however we may use that, but I'd like to go through that capital discussion of the unfunded portion before going much further. So having said that, I think there are some things that are in this budget that we're going to deliberate. I think there are some levels in this budget that may be too low that I think we're going to deliberate when we get to that. And that might be one time and taking things out of ending fund balance, which is historically what we've often done, during this part of the budget, the deliberation process. There's a list of, okay, what do we want to do with these? And so I still think we're going to go through that process. They're going to be very transactional, budget related, but I think the larger kind of develop a plan, I think needs to go through that capital effort first.
Got it. And for both of you who are talking about this, you're seeing it, I mean, that have mentioned it in the last 2 minutes, you see this as part of, before we finalize the 2019 budget, or as a 2019 activity after we finalize the 2019 budget?
I think there's going to be a little, I think the transactional items are going to happen as budget, but I think the larger plan for the larger amount balance is going to be later.
Councilmember Ray, are you also, that's also?
Both. Yeah,
both.
I mean, some of what we're going to deal with now, and because there's, I think, some unfunded needs, and we have a way to do that in the 19 budget, and I think we should. And then I think as we move forward, we'll find other places where we can make a difference for the community.
Other questions or comments? Councilmember Hunt?
I think that the concept of having a contingency fund is intriguing, and I would like to understand better how other communities are using that, and if other communities have a plan that involves general fund reserves and sort of periodically siphoning it off. I think that does make a lot of sense. I don't think our policy really defines it clearly how we would use a plan to fund that contingency. But I would be interested to explore that better, because I think having a contingency fund makes sense.
Got it. Council Deputy President Batiste?
Just to follow up on that, I would say that I too would like to look at the contingency fund as we're going forward, and I think that while we do have these capital projects, and I'd like to have a discussion about what we would like to do, but that it could be that some of that follows going through finalizing the budget. But there could be some outstanding, just as we're talking about levels of service and some of the different areas that we've gone through, that there could be some of those areas that we look at during deliberations.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of the dual approach of seeing what comes up in this budget process while keeping in mind that this conversation in early 2019 will be informed and in some cases constrained by what we decide to do with this upcoming budget. So, and I also really like the idea of looking at how other cities implement contingency funds and seeing how, seeing their rationales and magnitudes and those sorts of things. Councilmember Ramos?
Yeah, so I think we need to look at that as we go through the budget, as most folks, I think, are in agreement here, and make those decisions. I'm just very happy that years of watching our budget closely has put us in a pretty enviable position right now to be sitting on 45% versus trying to scrap up a 15% general fund balance. So that puts us in a really nice place to be able to do some of the things we want to do and set those priorities. And when we're trying to trade things back and forth in that budget, and we all have some flexibility to do the things we really want to do. So look forward to those deliberations. Contingency fund is kind of weird. I remember how we started that, and we did it one time and basically didn't do it again because we talked about the general fund is basically our contingency fund, and that's why we have a 20% reserve there as part of that. So to have another reserve set aside, it was, to me, kind of redundant and not necessarily needed, because we already increased, because I think we were, 10 to 15%, now we're 15 to 20%, so we actually increased our general fund balance requirement. So I would have no problem with doing what we need with that contingency fund to spend it, and keep our general fund balance going as using that versus having a complicated system of contingency fund and general fund balance and those kinds of things. Unless we're going to decide to purposely design it and feed it, there's no point to have it one time put some money in a pocket and leave it there.
No, not as a one-time and never do anything again, but if you're going to potentially feed it, I had a friend back in college who had a credit card, and she put it in a bowl of water in the freezer and froze it. And so if she wanted to use the credit card, she had to take the time to unfreeze it to use it. And to me, a contingency fund could be that frozen bowl of water, because it's not just sitting in the regular fund that everybody has access to. We have to intentionally say, we're going to go do this. And so I can see an argument for it, and I'm interested to hear how other cities do it. But I agree with you, to just, the way we've got it today is not all that useful. A small amount compared to our ending fund balance that we did once and haven't touched in a while, so.
Right, and just to counterbalance that, but that's what, our ending fund balance does have some of those, basically those same restrictions on it. We can't use it for operating, we can't use those things according to our own restrictions. So we've already basically have the same restrictions on that in a sense. So there you go.
Councilmember nope. I see. Councilmember Hunt, your mic is.
Oh, well, I just agree. I mean, I don't think that it makes sense if it's defined as exactly the same as our general fund balance, but if it's not defined, and if it's more clearly defined as a use for an emergency, immediate need, which was my understanding. And again, it would be good to see other cities' rationale, but I think if it's defined differently and there's a different policy for how to use it, then it potentially makes more sense.
And if I may say, I think that's in the legislation that formed it. I think we went through all of this, so
We should look at how the guidance that our forebears gave us on this topic. Well, you and I. All right. Anything else before we move on to the next topic? I think we have one major topic left, and then we'll get to public comment.
Just a question at your pleasure here, given that it's 9:15-ish. I'll just mention we sent responses to council questions. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that you might have. Council President, if there are questions here, we can take the time to do that, but otherwise, I will also just, again, say we're available, call, write, happy to provide whatever else you need. And if we missed the mark, if we didn't capture your question correctly or the answer wasn't what you anticipated, please help us to provide what you need.
Do you need any further clarity from us from new questions that you've heard tonight?
I don't believe so.
Anything from any of us? Oh, okay.
Okay, one
Next
last
up.
slide. Just want to make sure we're on the same page about intentions. So next week, we have no more presentations, planned presentations. So the 13th was meant just for deliberations. And per our budget calendar, intent was to have all those deliberations on the 13th and then prepare the final budget to bring forward on December 3rd for council action. So in order to do that, we certainly need to hear tonight, now, and I sent out an email previously Monday, what your needs are for additional information, what we can prepare and bring to that meeting if you need it, and what topics you anticipate raising with your colleagues as potential deliberation topics. I have a little Word document that I have also sent out just to remind you of what we had queued up in the first meeting. We kind of put things in two different buckets: desired actions and required actions. And the required actions are by state law. You have to do certain things like adopt the property tax levy. And then the desired ones were things like discuss senior center long-term operations. Do you want to incorporate that or not? So we had a bunch on those two lists. Well, that will be the starting place. My recommendation, starting place for deliberations is to go back to that list and work through each of those. If there are additional topics that you feel are appropriate for budget deliberation, let's get those identified too. I will then have a follow-up conversation with council leadership about how to make sure we make good use of our time, and perhaps where we have common themes about what you want to talk about. And then I do anticipate we've identified several here tonight, additional topics that aren't necessarily ones that we need to dive in deep on the 13th on, but we want to bring those back for future work sessions. We want additional information throughout 2019 so that we can have policy conversations.
Councilmember Winterstein.
So is this the chance to maybe identify line items I may want to have a conversation with my colleagues about on deliberations? And one in particular I do want to address, it has to do with the community fund grants, in particular the amount that's been awarded to the Village Theater. I think I'd encourage all of my colleagues to look at what has been done in the past there and try to understand what was offered here. I'm going to propose a different amount in that. Discuss it.
Okay.
Consistent with past awards.
Got it. All right. Other questions, comments, concerns, observations? Right. Okay. Oh, Councilmember Hunt.
So we had talked about this previously. I'm not sure if it's on the list, but I'm interested as one line item to talk about the Green Necklace Central Issaquah Code Review and Update, which is currently unfunded, and how we could fund that.
Councilmember Ray.
Process question, so you want us to send you topics we would like to discuss, is that correct?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And
No, yeah, but I want some thoughtful thinking time.
thank you.
Councilmember Winterstein.
And I did have one more, and I don't believe this has been touched upon. It's completely in a different part of the budget, and it's been a long time since I saw, so there's an amount in there for the funding of Route 269, Metro 269. And maybe this is just a question you can get. I don't want to deliberate that, but we had gotten metrics in the past, and there was performance metrics, and there was objectives for that. We partner with other jurisdictions along with Metro, and I just would like to get kind of an update on it. Thank you.
Anything else before we go to public comment? And twice? 3 times. All right. So thank you, everyone in the from the community who's here this evening, who's stayed with us. And I will now offer anybody who wishes to speak to us is you're free to have 3 minutes. And if you want to come up to the microphone, and you're welcome to tell us who you are and your relationship to the city. Or, if you've just enjoyed what you've had and that's fine too. Does anyone wish to provide public comment this evening on any of the topics? Debbie, we'll start with you.
Well, now that we know all about the city budget after 3 hours, and we know you have 13 million extra. There's been first of all, I'm Debbie Berto with Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park. There's been a little bit of controversy, including this summer at your meeting when you had the presentation about our organization, and in the past on the Services Committee, Tola in particular, has been concerned that we were providing staffing, and that wasn't the intent of the community grants. As you said, it was capacity building. So the move for us to a service contract makes a lot of sense. We hope you think that the funding by the city that provides FLISP is like an investment, an extension of your economic development and your park programs. It often feels like us, to our friends group, is working more to benefit the city, its environment, its park system, its business community, and its citizens. Consider some of our accomplishments. We've helped bring $7 million in capital improvements to the park in our first 4 years in existence. This year, we requested from the state legislature $200,000 for state parks to do a pre-design report, also known as an update to the parks master plan. And with this report in hand, the state parks will be able to request future legislative funding in $5 million or above. Our volunteers have done restoration work on over 5 acres of wetlands in the park, including many of those along Issaquah Creek that, of course, are at the mouth of the creek leading into the city. Each year, we offer direct marketing opportunities for about 50 local businesses who become vendors at park events. We bring celebrations to the community unlike any others in the Issaquah area. Our Walk and Wag 3K Dog Walk. 2 all-access play days encouraging children with disabilities to learn the special attributes of the state's very best playground, which of course we raised all the money for. Our best-known event is Parkadilly, already the Eastside's premier children's fair, with an emphasis on outdoor recreation. And there's the Camp Some More Family Campout, focused on engaging first-time campers. Coming up in a couple of weeks is a new holiday event, Light Up the Night, a lighted people parade, and we hope you'll all get lit with us. We hope you will also join us next summer if we manage to bring to fruition a beach party at the park that will be just for adults, complete with margaritas. We promote the heck out of all events in the park, though, those that are open to the public. And there could be a cross-country meet that was just a week or 2 ago, the fishing derby, the professional volleyball tournament, the Holy Festival of Colors. Okay, encouraging more people to discover the park and the city of Issaquah. We need a lot of staff to get all that done. Last year, you provided $30,000 for us, and we have again asked for $30,000. The recommendation from the committee when they were looking at grants was to lower that amount, and we ask that you reconsider and fund us the full $30,000. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to us this evening? Yes, ma'am.
So thank you very much. I'm Therese Vafizadeh. I'm the Executive Director of Tavon Center. We provide day and community programs for adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities. About half the people that we serve have autism, and in the next decade, we expect that the number of young people entering adulthood with autism to increase by 123%. We currently serve 100 people, so we anticipate we're going to be serving a lot more. We've asked for funding for a technology and a training grant for our staff. As you can imagine, being a staff person and having to keep all the information about people who have complex medical and behavioral needs in their head can be really difficult. And I'll just give you a really good example of why we would like to be able to have our information readily available. This last Monday, we had to call the medics for a young man who was having a medical problem. We were able to go to the file cabinet, pull his chart with his demographics and his health history and his medications. Had our staff been out in the community, which is where we spend most of our time, we have a book on the van, but they're not always at the van. They wouldn't have had this. But if they were able to pull up the information on their phone right there, this would have been quite easy for the medics to have all that information. So we asked originally for about $20,000. It's been decreased to $11,500, which would be great if we could get it, even better to get $20,000. So I just ask that you consider keeping it at the original amount. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Sir, did you have? Okay, sir.
Hello, my name is David Dunphy. I am the president-elect of the Issaquah Alps Trail Club. So I'm here to thank the council for your continued support of our organization. With the funding that we've received, it's really been able to leverage our executive director to help make more volunteer opportunities. I want to talk about kind of 3 big categories that we've been able to accomplish in this last quarter. One being outreach, the second being operations, and the third being our partnerships. With Our organization provides free community hikes to allow people to explore the Issaquah Alps. We've been able to strengthen those by offering family hikes with partnerships with the YMCA and some Amish Walks organizations, and also targeting senior populations. We've been able to hold community forums in Marymount and Taos communities, along with the mayor, have over 200 people attending, so getting more people informed about issues around conservation. And working with the Parks Department, we've been able to distribute 10 of their boxes of that beautiful map of our trail system so they can really start exploring our backyard. In operations, we've been really excited. We brought a map tonight that we might throw out at the end, but it shows just like what conservation has changed in this area and how citizens have been a part of it to welcome more citizens to that. We've gone through a rebranding process, and we have a new website that's going to allow for more people to be able to collaborate and join our club and write articles and be a part of that. And we're really excited about our 40-year anniversary that we're celebrating next year. And then finally, in our partnerships, we've continued to work with Lake Sammamish, the Friends Group, and looking at that master plan and how that is going to just really be that gateway into our beautiful Alps. We've continued our partnership with the Mountaintown Greenway, attending their board meetings, working with King County on specific parcels that we want to enter into our park system. And we're really excited to have some teenagers that are going to be joining our board starting in January, so we went through that process. So yeah, just again, just like really thank you for this opportunity to have these resources to really grow our organization. It allows us to really think about how conservation is going to look differently as we invite the diversity of our community into the work that we've been doing for the last 40 years.
Thank you very much for your comments. Anyone else wishing to speak? Corey?
I'm Corey Walters, Executive Director of the Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank. We're just down the street at 179 First Avenue Southeast. I just want to thank the council for your continual support, and the city, Emily, for your support of the food bank. We really appreciate being considered for the Community Fund Grant for our Groceries to Go program. We asked the council and city to support us in getting some new refrigeration, funding some work getting the electrical up to date, and helping us grow that program. Right now we're serving 70 households every single week, and we would love to double that number. In order to do that, we need more shelving, more refrigeration, so to increase our capacity in our building. So thank you for your support, and thank you for supporting our local nonprofits.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else wishing to speak this evening? Sir?
Hello, I'm Frank Stillwagner. I'm the Development Director at Village Theater, and I want to thank you all for your support over the many years, over the last 40 years. Actually, Village Theater will be celebrating its 40th anniversary in 2019, and I'm here to just talk a little bit about your past support and continued support. So over the past 40 years, Village Theater, we have grown to be the largest fully producing theater in the region with an annual budget this fiscal year of $13.4 million. We welcome over 200,000 people annually to Issaquah through our programming. We provide youth education and outreach programs for more than 57,000 young people and their families annually. And we are one of the nation's leading theaters in the development of new musicals. Annually, Village Theater employs more than 500 artists, performers, musicians, designers, directors, stage technicians, and educators. Our main stage season, which starts down at the Francis J. Gaudette Theater down the street, consists of 5 shows with a total of 243 performances occurring over 184 days out of the year, and runs from September through July, with 34 weeks of production just in Issaquah. Village Theater currently owns and operates 4 properties here in Issaquah. 2 theaters on Front Street. First Stage Theater is where it all began, which was raised and rebuilt in its likeness 9 years ago. We welcome you to come to the gallery at First Stage to see the history. of its origins in 1913, and it now serves as our home for developing new musicals and for our youth education outreach programs. The Francis J. Gaudette Theater was built in 1994, seats 488 in a historic-like theater, and it's our main stage. It's where we produce our 5-show season each year. It also houses our administrative and production offices, rehearsal studios, costume shop, as well as 2 storefronts, Opus Bank and Finn's Bistro. You invested in both of those projects to the sum of $250,000 combined for those projects. We also own and operate a 15,000 square foot production studio, the Craig and Joan Watchman Production Studios, which are located on First Avenue Northwest. They're adjacent to the Issaquah Creek and Confluence Park. The production studios house our scene shop, paint shop, and prop shop, and it's where all of our scenic designs begin for our main stage as well as our youth education programs. The city invested in that project to the tune of $75,000. Currently, we are in the midst of a capital campaign for our warehouse and artist residence project, and I guess this is our 3rd year coming to you. In year 1, we had asked for $100,000 in support of those 2 projects. We now own the land next to our warehouse, where we will be building, next to the production studios, where we're going to be building our warehouse. And we just recently purchased a 4-plex at 109 Dogwood, which is currently under renovation. So if you've seen the pod out there on Dogwood, yep. And so what we are doing is asking for you to restore the $25,000, because it was originally, we understand it was a verbal commitment because the mayor and the city can't commit over multiple years, but the $100,000 over 4 years. So we're asking respectfully that from the 12.5 to be restored to $25,000 in support of these projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments.
You bet.
Anyone else wishing to speak to us this evening? Ma'am?
Council members, I am Linda Woodall. I'm Executive Director of Eastside Friends of Seniors. Mostly, I want to just say thank you. Appreciate the city's support of the human service organizations that serve the people of your community. We are one of those organizations. We serve approximately 500 vulnerable seniors in the greater Issaquah and Sammamish area, approximately 3/4 of which have an Issaquah address. The majority of the people we serve are low or very limited income, and your support is much appreciated. As you look at what to do with a little bit of your reserves, I would encourage you to take a close look at that opportunity to increase the amount that you're supporting human service organizations in our community. We have many valuable ones, and we could all use probably just a tad bit more. So thank you very much. We appreciate your support.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to us this evening? Anyone else? Second call? Third call? Any other closing budget comments from anyone? City Administrator Moon, anything more from you? Thank you once again for you and your staff for the material you put together this evening, and the material you'll be putting together for our next meeting, and probably for the meeting after that. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.